Hello everyone. Welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. It's the evening of March 10, 1995, and the Victoria concert hall stands bathed in a soft golden glow. Inside, the air is thick with anticipation, the kind that settles over a crowd waiting for something extraordinary to unfold. The Singapore Symphony Orchestra is about to perform, and the audience waits with bated breath. The lights dim, and a hush sweeps through the hall. Then the music begins. Somewhere among the crowd sits a man, and at first glance, he appears ordinary, just another concert goer that's lost in the melody. He's Caucasian, perhaps in his mid-30s, with neatly trimmed hair and an impassive face. But if you watch closely, there's something unsettling about the way he carries himself. His eyes are alert, almost too aware, as though he's seeing beyond the beauty of the performance. His name is John Martin Scripps, and unlike the rest of the audience, John's night won't end like everyone else's. While others will head home and carry on with their lives, John will return to a grim reality. By the next day, he'll be carrying out plans far more sinister than anyone around him could ever imagine. As the final note fades and the crowd rises to its feet, John stands as well. He claps along with everyone else, a polite smile stretched across his lips. Leaving the concert hall, he weaves through the bustling crowd out into the warm night air of Singapore. Less than 12 hours later, John would become one of Singapore's most wanted men. Within weeks, his name would spread across the country. 3 different continents tied to crimes that included brutal murders, calculated fraud, and a spree of deception that left investigators scrambling. It's unsettling to think that just 2 days earlier, he had arrived quietly from the UK, slipping into the country without raising a single alarm. But only hours after the concert, this very man would be dragging a heavy, blood-stained suitcase to the banks of the Singapore River. With a final shove, he'd send its grisly contents into the dark, churning waters below. The real question is, what happened in those short 48 hours to bring him to this point? How did a seemingly innocent evening at the symphony become the prelude to a chain of events so shocking and unimaginable? What's even more troubling is that this case almost went undiscovered. John Martin Scripps had come alarmingly close to slipping through the cracks and escaping justice. But fortunately, as it often does, the truth would eventually emerge. When the world learned the full extent of his crimes, Scripps gained infamy, collecting several chilling nicknames. The most notorious of them all was the Garden City Butcher. You're listening to Hans, an Asian true crime podcast brought to you by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. It was March 8, 1995. The humid air of Changi Airport buzzed with the energy of travelers. People rushed from terminal to terminal, the sounds of announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. Amid the bustling crowd stood George Lowe, a South African chemical engineer in his early 30s. He had traveled from Johannesburg to Singapore with a straightforward goal to hunt for affordable electronics and enjoy his first visit to the vibrant city. Before leaving Johannesburg, George Low had carefully laid out his travel plans to his wife, Vanessa, who at the time worked as an airline employee. He assured her that he would call as soon as he checked into his hotel in Singapore, saying, "If you don't hear from me on March 10th, it means I've managed to get a seat on the plane and will be back in South Africa on the 11th. But if I do call on the 10th, it means I couldn't get a seat and will return on the 12th." Vanessa agreed, but couldn't help feeling worried. The love of her life would soon be thousands of miles away. And in an era when international phone calls were costly, all she could do was wait anxiously for his call. However, when Low landed at Singapore Changi Airport on the morning of March 8, his plans took an unexpected turn. He was approached by a man named Simon Davis, who struck up a friendly conversation. Davis spoke with an easy charm, mentioning his own interest in electronics, which immediately created a sense of familiarity between the two men. The conversation flowed effortlessly from one topic to the next, as if they had known each other for more than just a chance meeting at the airport. As the two men talked, it wasn't long until the discussion shifted to something practical: accommodation. Davis asked if Low had already arranged his hotel stay in Singapore, and Low confirmed that he had. Davis then proposed an idea. If Low was willing, he'd be happy to share the hotel room and split the cost evenly. It was a reasonable offer, and Davis, who appeared harmless, seemed trustworthy enough. They were both of similar age, both Caucasian and both first-time visitors to Singapore. With so many shared details, Low had no reason to be suspicious. Just two tourists trying to save money and make the most of their time. What could possibly go wrong? They hailed a taxi together, chatting as they made their way to the Riverview Hotel. It was a decent establishment, well situated and offering great views of the Singapore River. And as the city's vibrant lights streamed past the windows of the cab, Low likely felt reassured by Davis's company. Upon arriving at the hotel, they stepped into the cool, softly lit lobby. Davis took charge of the check-in process, effortlessly signing his name alongside Low's on the registration form. Everything appeared straightforward, and within minutes they were making their way to room 1511, ready to settle in. On the surface, their arrangement was perfectly logical. Two travelers sharing a room to save money. But beneath the veneer of convenience and casual camaraderie, a sense of unease lingered, almost imperceptible. The door to room 1511 clicked shut, signaling a brief moment of rest for Low before he set out to explore the vibrant city. But for Davis, it marked the beginning of something else. His new roommate, Simon Davis, wasn't who he claimed to be, and his entire conversation with George was built on lies. His real name was John Martin Scripps, a man with a dark past and even darker intentions. John was born on December 9, 1959 in Hertfordshire, England, a place just outside of London. He was the youngest child of Leonard and Jean Scripps. His father, Leonard, was a lorry driver, and his mother, Jean, worked as a barmaid. John was raised in a modest working-class household. From an early age, he experienced long stretches of travel, often accompanying his father on road trips in the lorry. He had developed a strong bond with his father, Leonard, who despite his gruff exterior, provided a sense of stability and security in Jay's young life. But everything changed when John was just 9 years old. In 1969, Leonard Scripps tragically took his own life, an event that shattered John's world. The loss left a lasting scar and John struggled to cope. His performance in school suffered, and the curious, adventurous boy he once was became a troubled teenager. He faced extreme difficulties with reading and writing and was later diagnosed with dyslexia, which made school an overwhelming and frustrating experience. By the age of 15, John had dropped out, unable to fit into the academic world that seemed stacked against him. In the years that followed, John found himself overwhelmed by mounting troubles. Desperate for a way out, he turned to one of the few things that had once brought him joy and connection with his late father: travel. Traveling became his way of life, a means of outrunning his grief. To sustain himself, he took up odd jobs, sold antiques, and did whatever he could to keep moving. The sense of freedom was intoxicating, but it developed a sense of isolation that would follow him for years. It wasn't long before John realized that this life of constant movement came at a cost. In May of 1974, at just 14 years old, John faced the Highgate Juvenile Court, convicted of burglary. But the punishment, a 12-month conditional discharge and a £10 fine, was a light sentence, hardly enough to deter him. By August 1976, he had already been arrested 3 more times for theft, displaying a growing pattern of criminal behavior that was only getting worse. The court's light punishment did little to set him on a different path. Reports suggest that John had committed these petty crimes in order to fund his travels. But the offenses didn't stop there. In June 1978, he crossed yet another line. This time charged with indecent assault and fined £40. On the surface, it seemed like just another youthful misstep, one more offense to add to a growing list of petty crimes. Yet, beneath the apparent triviality of this incident lay a disturbing pattern. John's crimes were getting bolder by the day. It was no longer just about theft or burglary, or rather crimes that were committed out of necessity. He was very likely committing these crimes out of thrill. In the late 70s, while traveling through Mexico, John met a woman named Maria Perel Arianos from the city of Cancun. It was an instant connection and the two quickly fell in love. Fast forward to the year 1980, the pair got married and began a life of adventure together. For the next 2 years, they journeyed side by side, but their travels came to an abrupt end. In 1982, when John was arrested and sentenced to a 3-year prison term for theft, burglary, and resisting arrest, Maria was deeply affected by his imprisonment and the strain on their relationship began to grow. According to the records, she had no idea what John's real occupation was before his conviction. He had told her he was involved in the import and export business, but in reality, he was a full-time criminal surviving off a series of petty crimes. Despite the betrayal, Maria's love for John compelled her to give him another chance. She pleaded with him to turn his life around and leave crime behind for good. But instead of turning things around for the better, John only spiraled deeper into trouble. In the UK, there is a program designed for non-violent offenders that allows them to return home for a few days to visit their families before completing the remainder of their prison sentence. The purpose of this program is to help inmates reintegrate into society, offering them a chance to reconnect with loved ones and start preparing for a life beyond prison. It was June of 1985 and John was one of the few inmates who were granted this privilege. Just months before he was set to finish his sentence, he received permission to go home and spend time with his family. But instead of using this opportunity to turn his life around, John had other plans. Seizing the chance to escape, he disappeared during his home leave and quickly returned to his old ways, committing another burglary almost immediately. This fresh crime earned him an additional 3 years in prison. By then, Maria had reached her limit. Heartbroken and unable to cope any longer, she filed for a divorce. Not long after, she remarried. This time to a police constable named Ken Cold. Prison records suggest that John was an exemplary inmate. He maintained good behavior, never caused trouble with the prison staff, and generally followed the rules. This earned him the rare privilege of a second home leave to visit his family, even though he had previously escaped during a prior leave. Just as he was about to embark on this second visit, however, John learned that Maria had remarried. The news of her union with a police constable filled him with rage and a deep sense of betrayal. Consumed by anger, he sought revenge, using the opportunity to steal some of her new husband's clothing during his home leave. It wasn't until Maria eventually divorced again and returned to her hometown that John's fury finally began to subside. Once he had completed his extended prison sentence, John made a drastic change. He legally dropped the name Scripps and began a new chapter as John Martin. On the surface, it appeared as though he was trying to shed the troubled identity he had built over the years, perhaps hoping for a fresh start and a chance to leave his criminal past behind. But this move was never a bid for redemption. It was to prepare for something even darker. Under his new identity as John Martin, he quickly became involved in drug trafficking, smuggling heroin between Asia and Europe for an organized syndicate. It wasn't long before his illegal activities drew the attention of authorities. In 1987, he was arrested at Heathrow Airport, caught red-handed with drugs in his possession. During the arrest, officers discovered a key on him, which led to a safe deposit box in Singapore. Inside they found 1.5 kilograms of heroin valued at over $1 million US. In 1988, John was handed a 7-year prison sentence for drug trafficking. However, his time behind bars was far from uneventful. He made multiple escape attempts and in 1992, he even managed to break free for a short time before being quickly recaptured. These repeated offenses prompted the court to add another 6 years to his sentence, meaning he was expected to stay locked up until the year 2001. But, as we know, things didn't turn out that way. John was eventually transferred to a prison on the Isle of Wight, a small island situated along the English Channel. There, he once again established himself as a model inmate. He was also enrolled in programs designed to develop his technical skills, starting with simple tasks like dishwashing and general cleaning. He eventually trained as a butcher under the guidance of an experienced prison caterer and an inmate who had been a professional butcher. He mastered the art of slicing and breaking down raw meat. His precision and efficiency did not go unnoticed. Fellow prisoners and even the prison staff were impressed by how quickly he excelled at his craft. but no one could have guessed that the butchery skills he honed behind bars would later be used for something far darker. In 1995, John Martin, who was under the alias Simon Davis, entered the Riverview Hotel with George Lowe. The next morning, John approached the hotel receptionist, casually asking for Lowe's name to be removed from the registration. He claimed that he felt uncomfortable because Lowe was a homosexual and had made unwanted advances towards him while he was asleep. But in reality, George Lowe was no longer in any position to leave. John Martin Scripps, known to his unsuspecting companion as Simon Davis, was no longer the friendly traveler he had pretended to be. And for George Lowe, the South African tourist who had innocently agreed to share the room, he could not have imagined the horror that awaited him. With a calculating calm, John made his move. What happened next was a brutal, calculated act of violence. As the life drained from his victim, John wasted no time. The man who had once been a model inmate, learning butchery skills in prison, now applied those same techniques to a grisly purpose. Using knives he had brought with him, he dismembered George Lowe's body, separating the limbs at the joints and methodically cutting through flesh and bone. As he worked, the hotel bathroom resembled a makeshift slaughterhouse with blood splattering the walls and even the ceiling. Once the dismemberment was complete, John meticulously cleaned the scene. He likely spent hours ensuring no evidence would tie him to the murder, scrubbing away any trace of blood, and disposing of any soiled linens. The severed parts of George's body were then carefully wrapped in plastic and put in a suitcase. By the time the sun rose over Singapore, John had already begun covering his tracks. He had left room 1511, outwardly composed, and went about his business with an eerie sense of normalcy. Using Lowe's credit cards, he withdrew thousands of dollars buying electronics, sending gifts to his sister, and even enjoying a symphony performance, all while concealing the grisly truth of what he had done. But he wasn't finished. Under the cover of darkness, he dragged the heavy suitcase to the banks of the Singapore River and one by one released the contents into the churning water, watching as they disappeared into the depths. In his mind, the river would hide his crime, swallowing the evidence and leaving him free to continue his twisted journey. Or so he thought. On March 13th, 4 days later, a pair of severed legs neatly cut at the knees surfaced in a plastic bag off Clifford Pier. 3 days later, more body parts had been discovered, haunting the waters of Singapore with their gruesome presence. The island's authorities were now faced with a grim and perplexing mystery. Somewhere out there, a killer was on the loose. They couldn't yet determine if these remains belonged to a single victim or if they were dealing with multiple murders. But what sent a shiver through even the most seasoned investigators was the way the body had been dismembered. Each cut was clean and executed with deadly precision. Whoever had done this was a master at their craft. They were someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and that made them far more dangerous. But the real nightmare for the authorities was just beginning. Unbeknownst to them, their most wanted man was already gone, slipping away on a plane and vanishing beyond the borders of the country. Catching him would be a nearly impossible task, and the clock was already ticking. John Martin Scripps was no ordinary traveler. On the outside, he appeared to be a seasoned adventurer, someone well versed in navigating new cultures and cities. But beneath this facade lay a dangerous predator with a chilling image, one that had been honed through years of deception and violence. His life of crime was anything but straightforward. In October 1993, just 2 months after being transferred to a new prison, Scripps had escaped once again. This time after being denied parole. His mother, Jean, had even warned the authorities about his escape plans, but her concerns were dismissed. After breaking free, Scripps forged a new identity to continue pursuing his twisted ambitions. Using the birth certificate of a fellow inmate by the name of Simon James Davis, he acquired a passport which allowed him to slip away undetected. He then fled to Mexico, where he convinced the British embassy to issue him another passport, claiming he had lost his previous one. To the officials handling his visa, he introduced himself as John Martin. It was a name he used to slip seamlessly into the world of travel he adored, though this time his journeys were driven by far more sinister motives. On the morning of the 9th of March, 1995, there was no sign of George Lowe. Scripps had gone down to the front desk and instructed the hotel receptionist to delete Lowe's name from the room registration system. The staff, unaware of the horrifying truth, did so without question. Now in possession of Lowe's credit cards and personal belongings, Scripps used it to fund his travels. Starting with a visit to a DBS Bank branch at Raffles City Shopping Center, where he withdrew a staggering $6,000 in a single transaction. Over the next few days, he would make additional withdrawals totaling $2,400 from Lowe's account. But Scripps wasn't content with just the cash. He indulged in luxuries that spoke to his growing confidence. Using the stolen credit card, he purchased a videotape recorder and even mailed it to his sister in England. He also treated himself to a pair of Nike Alpha Trainer shoes worth $180. A purchase that reflected his appetite for extravagance. Then on March 11, 3 days after the murder, Scripps visited a travel agency on Anson Road. There, he wired over $12,000 to one of his bank accounts in San Francisco that was under the alias John Martin. That same evening, he paid cash for a return ticket to Phuket via Bangkok and left the country at 7 p.m. If John Martin Scripps had been a sensible man, he would have taken this moment to disappear completely. He was already on a plane with passport in hand, so it would have been the perfect opportunity to vanish into the distance and possibly evade capture forever. But for John, it seems that it wasn't enough. The murder of George Lowe was just the beginning, and he was only getting started. Canadian tourists Sheila May Dimao and her son Darren John Dimao had always been close. As a dedicated administrator at the Pacific Christian School in Victoria, Canada, Sheila devoted her days to ensuring her students had the best possible educational experience. Her son Darren was a bright and enthusiastic college student eager to explore the world and soak in new adventures. The bond between mother and son was unbreakable. And in 1995, they set off together on a long-anticipated holiday to Thailand. Darren arrived first in Bangkok, filled with excitement and anticipation for the journey that lay ahead. It was his first time in Southeast Asia, and the allure of new experiences fueled his sense of adventure. Sheila soon joined him during his spring break, and now the mother and son were ready to begin their holiday. On March 15, 1995, they took a short flight from the capital Bangkok to the island of Phuket. They were excited to explore this tropical wonderland. But they were not alone. Seated in the same row as them on the plane was a British man who introduced himself as John Martin. The encounter seemed innocent enough, and John stirred up a friendly conversation. What the damouts couldn't have known was that John Martin was merely an alias. The man chatting amiably with them was in fact John Martin Scripps, an experienced killer, who just a week prior had gruesomely murdered, dismembered, and robbed a South African tourist in Singapore. This meeting with the dam now seemed like a chance encounter, but for Scripps, it was all part of a carefully constructed plan. As they exchanged pleasantries, Scripps continued to weave his facade of a fellow traveler, and soon they agreed to stay at the same hotel. Upon landing in Phuket, the trio made their way to Niles Marina Inn, a quaint hotel with a beautiful view of the Andaman Sea. Sheila and Darren checked into room 43, while Scripps was assigned room 48 right next door. It seemed like an ordinary arrangement, a mother and son on vacation, sharing a hotel with another friendly tourist. But this would be the last time anyone would see Sheila and Darren alive. The morning of March 16, 1995 began like any other with Sheila and Darren sharing a hearty breakfast as they discussed their plans for the day. But a couple hours later, around 11 a.m., Scripps approached the receptionist at the inn, requesting to move into room 43. He explained that Sheila and Darren had suddenly departed, and assured the staff that he would settle their bill. Without any concerns, the receptionist agreed to his request. From that moment on, Sheila and Darren were never seen again. Their sudden disappearance had raised no immediate alarm, and the days quickly slipped by. It wasn't until their family in Canada grew increasingly worried that the investigation into their whereabouts began. You see, Sheila had a pattern of staying in touch, and when communication had stopped entirely after March 15, her family sensed that something was wrong. In response, they reached out to the authorities in Thailand, desperate for answers. And 5 days later, the first grim discovery was made. But before we reveal what it was, there's been a breakthrough in the investigation of George Low. Back in Singapore, a passerby had come across a plastic bag floating near Clifford Pier only to discover that it contained human remains. Inside were a pair of legs cleanly severed at the knees. As authorities continued their search, they uncovered more body parts, a pair of thighs, and a torso, but the rest of the body were never found. It wasn't long before the investigation linked these gruesome discoveries to John Martin Scripps and the murder of George Low. The connection began when the South African High Commission expressed concern over Low's sudden disappearance. He had arrived in Singapore on March 8, but soon after he seemed to vanish without a trace, prompting his wife, Vanessa, to raise the alarm. When George failed to call or return home to Johannesburg, a desperate and worried Vanessa reached out to his colleagues, who immediately began searching for any clues about his whereabouts. Once the authorities in Singapore received Vanessa's missing person report, they began investigating whether the body parts discovered near Clifford Pier could be linked to George. And it wasn't long before the evidence all started to point towards John Martin Scripps. Using hotel records and credit card transactions, police retraced John's steps. They discovered that he had stayed at the Riverview Hotel with Low under the alias Simon Davis. The hotel's Front desk staff also confirmed that both men had checked in together and shared a room. Traces of blood found in room 1511 further confirmed that a violent crime had occurred there. Additionally, investigators learned that Scripps had gone on a shopping spree using Lowe's credit card shortly after the murder and had packed the dismembered body parts into a suitcase before disposing of them in the Singapore River. The police swiftly launched a manhunt for John, retracing his steps back to where it all began, the airport where he had first encountered Lowe. But around the same time, authorities in Thailand made a horrifying discovery. On March 19, 1995, the Royal Thai Police, who had been investigating the disappearance of Canadians, Sheila and her son Darren, stumbled upon two human skulls inside a disused tin mine in Phuket's Kath district. The remains were so badly decomposed that they couldn't be immediately identified, and it would take weeks for forensic experts to confirm that the remains belonged to the mother and son. But the horror doesn't end here. Just days later, more dismembered body parts, a torso, arms, and legs were found along Ban Nai Trang Road, nearly 10 kilometers from the original site. The remains were believed to be Sheila's, while the rest of Darren's body was never recovered. Investigators eventually constructed a chilling timeline. Sheila and Darren were last seen alive on the morning of March 15. The same day Scripps requested to change his room. This key detail pointed to Scripps as the one who had brutally murdered the mother and son, dismembered their bodies, and scattered their remains like discarded trash. However, by the time authorities began their pursuit, Scripps had already fled Thailand. Surely after taking 3 innocent lives, he would have seized the chance to disappear for good, to vanish into the shadows forever, right? Well, it turns out that while Scripps was a ruthless and brutal killer, he wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. In an unexpected turn, he was on a flight headed straight back to Singapore where the police were waiting for him at the airport. On March 19, 1995, John Martin Scripps was swiftly apprehended. Right as he landed in Changi Airport, he had arrived in Singapore under the alias Simon Davis, an identity already flagged by police after it was used to check into the Riverview Hotel with George Lowe. In his possession were 5 forged passports, including those belonging to Lowe and the Damudes, irrefutably linking him to the murders. Each passport had been tampered with, Scripps replacing his victims' photos with his own. Alongside the forged documents, authorities discovered tools in his luggage that were disturbingly consistent with those needed to dismember a body, such as knives and a hammer. With Scripps now in custody, the investigation into the gruesome murders of the Damudes and George Lowe was nearing its conclusion. However, this was just the beginning of many disturbing truths that would soon emerge about the man. News of John Martin Scripps, dubbed the tourist from hell, had spread rapidly across Singapore and soon gained international attention. This prompted investigators from the UK, Mexico, and the US to re-examine cold cases involving missing people and dismembered remains. Authorities in Scotland linked Scripps to the disappearance of 2 men from South London, Timothy McDowell and William Shackle. McDowell had vanished in Blyth, and while police found dismembered remains, they couldn't definitively identify him. However, a suspicious $21,000 transfer from McDowell's account to Scripps raised alarms. Shackle was also reported missing in Mexico after financial records showed he had cashed travelers' checks. But despite the Circumstantial evidence, authorities were unable to definitively link Scripps to his disappearance. Meanwhile, John Martin Scripps' time in custody wasn't without drama. Records state that he smashed a glass panel in the interview room and tried to harm himself, perhaps overwhelmed by the realization of his crimes and fear of the impending consequences. He was promptly taken to hospital for treatment. And now there was no escaping his fate. His trial for the latest murder was just around the corner and justice was closing in. By November 1995, the trial had reached its final phase. The prosecution's case was airtight. Scripps had intentionally killed George Lowe, dismembered his body, and disposed of the parts with chilling precision. The same gruesome method had also been employed on victims Sheila and Darren Damath in Thailand. At the end of the hearing, the judge delivered a merciless verdict, saying, "I am satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that Scripps is guilty of murder." John Martin Scripps was sentenced to death by hanging. Scripps had initially announced an intention to appeal on November 15, but inexplicably withdrew it just days before the hearing in January. He even refused to petition for clemency, calmly stating that he was impatient to be executed. In the days leading up to his execution, Scripps penned a series of haunting notes, but his dyslexia was evident in the sheer amount of misspelled words. He writes, according to the records, the night before his execution, John had a vivid dream of taking his own life and woke up in tears, calling out for his mother. Reports state that his mother expressed her anguish, blaming the judicial system for turning her son into what he had become. But despite her grief, the British government chose not to intervene. On the early morning of April 19, 1996, Scripps was served his last meal, pizza and hot chocolate. Then he was led to the gallows, becoming the first British national to be executed in Singapore since the nation's independence in 1965. Story 2. It was January of 1961 on an ordinary evening along a quiet street in Manila. Rows of houses stood side by side and many were silent and still where families settled into their routines. But inside one particular house, things were different. Inside the house was a man named Pablo Cabading, 45 years old, with a presence that seemed to fill every room. He was married to Asunyan, his wife of the same age, and together they had a 24-year-old daughter named Lydia. To anyone outside, they might have seemed like an ordinary family, and Pablo might have looked like a typical father, but those who lived under his roof knew otherwise. Pablo was not a man to be crossed, and he ruled the household with an iron will. His rules were strict, and he expected every member of his family to follow them without question. He wasn't just the head of the house, he was its law. For his daughter, life under his watchful eye was far from easy. Each day she moved carefully, always aware of her father's gaze, and the consequences if she ever went against his wishes. To her, the house didn't feel like a home at all. It felt like a cage she could never escape. Yet she was a bright young woman with dreams of her own. And when she met a man who showed her kindness, a man who promised her something different, she saw a chance to break free. With him, she began to imagine a future where she could make her own choices, live her own life. But that hope would soon set off a chain of events, leading to one of the most tragic crimes the Philippines had ever witnessed. In January of 1961, the usual quiet of the street where the carb-baiting household stood was violently broken by the crack of gunfire. Gunshots. Neighbors later recounted how the shots pierced the silence of the night, jolting them awake, and leaving them with a deep sense of unease. When the police arrived, they found themselves on the edge of a scene that would haunt them long after that night. Just outside the door, they could hear a faint, anguished voice from within, pleading for them to push it open. Slowly, they forced the door ajar and flicked on the light. The room was drenched in blood. The walls had been streaked red. Something unspeakable had happened here. There were multiple bodies that lay motionless on the floor, and each one of them had blood pooling beneath. As the police moved carefully through the room, a horrifying truth began to sink in. The entire carbiding family had been brutally slaughtered within their own home. Yet, amidst the devastation, a faint, desperate sign of life remained. One of them was still alive, fighting against the brutal injuries that she had suffered. It was the mother, 45-year-old Asunyan, lying amidst the blood-soaked floor. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps that were barely audible. This was unlike anything the Philippines had witnessed in years. And the officers knew they had to move quickly. She was their only chance to understand what had happened in this house. They knew that if her life slipped away, so would the answers they desperately needed. In the Philippines, there's a famous writer named Jose Rizal, a man who many locals regard as a national hero till this day. You see, back in the 1800s, the Philippines was a colony under Spanish control. For over 3 centuries, Spanish forces held power over the islands, enforcing their rule through strict laws, taxes, and a heavy influence of the Catholic Church. Locals at the time lived under extreme social and economic constraints with limited rights and little voice in government. And amid this, a growing desire for reform and freedom began to spread among them, especially among the educated. This was the world that Jose Rizal was born into. A world where speaking out against the government was dangerous, but for him necessary. Jose Rizal was originally trained as an eye doctor, but he would later go on to become one of the Philippines' most influential writers and thinkers. In 1887, he published his first novel named Nalay Matanhair, which boldly exposed the injustices and abuses suffered by Filipinos under Spanish rule. This book, along with his later works, became foundational to the Filipino propaganda movement, a campaign that advocated for political reforms and greater rights for the Philippine colony. However, several years later, he was arrested for rebellion and was executed by the Spanish government. Yet, even though the man died, his words lived on. It laid the foundation for the Philippines' journey toward independence, inspiring a collective fight against oppression and igniting a sense of national pride. Through his novels and essays, Raul awakened a spirit of resistance, one that rallied Filipinos from all walks of life to stand together in the struggle for freedom. He became a symbol of hope, a guiding light that reminded them that even under the harshest rule, the Filipino people's desire for justice and self-determination would never be extinguished. In his book, there's a woman named Maria Clara. To generations of Filipinos, she's a symbol, a name that carries the weight of what society has long expected from women. Maria Clara is the daughter of a wealthy Filipino woman and a Spanish priest, raised by her family to be the perfect woman. She's gentle, quiet, and deeply loyal. She embodies the qualities that were and still are often praised in women: obedience, modesty, and devotion to family. Maria Clara was engaged to her childhood love, Crostamo Ibarra, a young man with dreams of transforming the Philippines. And together, they had dreams for a bright future. But their plans were torn apart by political forces beyond their control. And Maria Clara had no choice but to choose between love and duty. In the end, she retreats to the solitude of a convent, giving up her dreams to preserve her family's honor. Over time, Maria Clara became a model for what society believed women should be: quiet, loyal, and enduring. Her story grew into an ideal of womanhood, where a woman's worth isn't defined by her own desires or ambitions, but by how well she served the needs of others. In this view, breaking free from these expectations could be seen as selfish, even shameful, especially if it meant bringing dishonor to one's family. For many Filipino women, Maria Clara's story still lingers. They feel the pressure to embody those same qualities. To be strong yet quiet, selfless yet restrained. And if they didn't meet these expectations, it could lead to judgment or rejection. However, for many, this ideal has become less of an inspiration and more of a burden. It's a constant reminder of the constraints placed on women's freedom and individuality. But what happens when this weight becomes unbearable? Sometimes she surrenders and endures a life of silent submission. But other times it ends in blood. In the 1960s, Metro Manila was a city caught between old world charm and the promise of modernity. Spanish and American influences had shaped every corner of the city. From the European architecture of ancestral homes to the Hollywood inspired fashion on the streets, men were often seen in tailored suits and women wore velvet gloves and large pearls around their necks. During this period, social status was everything, particularly for families with close ties to the government. For the Cabadating family, it was no different. Pablo Cabadating, in particular, seemed acutely aware of how others saw him. Though no one could say for sure, it was obvious from his demeanor and actions that he wanted to be perceived as powerful, successful, and perhaps even noble to him. Projecting an image of prestige was not just important, it was essential. In 1961, 45-year-old Pablo Cabadating was a plainclothes officer with the Manila Police Department. He's often described as someone who carried himself with authority. He was very tall and often stood out because of his height, and he also had a striking choice of colors and clothing which gave him a youthful appearance. His wife Asunyan, on the other hand, was described as a reserved woman, but she never failed to respond immediately to her husband's commands. Together they had a daughter named Lydia, as well as an adopted son who was 8 years old at the time. However, because Pablo was such an intense man, records indicate that both the young boy and even the household maids kept to the background, careful never to cross him. Pablo was known to be overbearing and kept a close, almost obsessive watch over his daughter, Lydia. Records state that as Lydia was growing up, he would threaten any young man who showed any interest in her, making it nearly impossible for Lydia to maintain any relationships. Under her father's intense scrutiny, Lydia's boyfriends rarely lasted long. Then, during her time as a medical intern, Lydia met 36-year-old Dr. Leonardo Quintanon, a professor at the University of Sto. Tomas. Leonardo had recently returned from a 6-year stint overseas, and was immediately drawn to Lydia's quiet demeanor, which complemented his own reserved nature. The two soon grew close, and it wasn't long before they began dating and introducing each other to their families. When Pablo met Leonardo, he surprisingly approved of him, an unusual reaction considering how he had treated Lydia's past suitors. With a rare hint of pride, Pablo admitted to Leonardo that most of the men who were interested in Lydia couldn't endure more than 10 minutes in his presence before leaving. But with Leonardo, it was different. Pablo even looked him in the eye and said, "I like you," showing an unexpected acceptance, a rare moment of approval in his otherwise strict control over Lydia's relationships. However, despite approving of Leonardo, Pablo continued to force himself into Lydia's life, often tagging along on the couple's outings, even joining them on their movie dates. Eventually, when Lydia and Leonardo expressed their wish to marry, Pablo agreed, but made his expectations clear and unbending. He demanded a grand wedding and a substantial dowry as the conditions for his blessing. The guest list he drew up also spoke volumes about his ambitions. He invited prominent figures, including the wife of a powerful governor and a rising senator named Ferdinand Marcos, who would eventually become the country's president. For Pablo, this wedding wasn't just about Lydia and Leonardo starting a life together. It was his chance to make a statement. He wanted everyone to see the Caboting family as important, as powerful, and under his command. But despite this, his most extreme demand was that the couple continued to live with him in the family home on Zapat Street after their marriage. Pablo had designed and built this house himself. And more than anything, he envisioned it as a place to keep Lydia by his side indefinitely. At the time, Leonardo was deeply in love with Lydia and hopeful for the life they could build together. Though he may have had his own reservations, he agreed to Pablo's demands, seeing it as a necessary step for their happiness. And so the marriage took place with all the grandeur Pablo had insisted upon. Afterward, the young couple moved into the house on Zapat Street, settling into a life that Leonardo hoped would be a new beginning. But any dreams of starting fresh soon felt overshadowed by the watchful presence of Pablo, who now had them exactly where he wanted, within the walls of a home that he controlled. Lydia and Leonardo's marriage was meant to be a fresh start, a step toward freedom from her father's control. But it quickly became clear that Pablo had no intention of letting go. Leonardo had underestimated the extent of his father-in-law's grip on the family and, living in the house on Zapat Street, he soon realized why Lydia had always been so secretive about her personal life. Pablo's influence wasn't just strong, it was suffocating. Records say that late one evening, Leonardo arrived at his family's home in Manila, visibly shaken. His car had broken down and he was frantic to get back to Zapat Street in Makati as quickly as possible. His brothers Jean and Analo were taken aback. It was just a car problem. So why the panic? Well, Leonardo explained that his father-in-law Pablo had strict rules. Everyone in the house had to be back by a set hour each night because after that the doors were locked and no one would be allowed in. Understanding the seriousness in his brother's tone, Jean immediately offered to drive him. The drive down would take about 40 minutes, but by the time they arrived at Zapat Street, the house was already dark and the gates were locked tight. Leonardo, unwilling to give up, rushed to the gate, gripping the railings and shaking them vigorously, hoping to wake someone inside. His voice echoed through the quiet street as he called out, pleading for someone to let him in. But the house remained silent and unresponsive. Watching his brother plead helplessly at the gate stirred a quiet anger in Jean. After half an hour, it became clear that no one was coming to open the door. Reluctantly, the two brothers returned to Manila. The next morning, Leonardo went back to Zapat Street only to be met with Pablo's smug, taunting expression. Despite Leo's explanation about his car breaking down, Pablo didn't believe him. Instead, he looked at Leo with disdain and made a pointed remark, suggesting he'd probably just been out wasting time on something trivial, like watching a basketball game. The comment struck a nerve. Leonardo could feel his patience slipping away, his frustration building as he realized how little his father-in-law respected him. This was the final straw. And now a quiet anger stirred in Leonardo as he grasped just how deeply Pablo's control was woven into every corner of their lives. It became clear to him at that moment that something had to change. Determined to take back control of their lives, he spoke with Lydia and together they decided that they couldn't continue living under Pablo's tight grip. They had to leave and start their lives fresh, free from her father's rules. And so that afternoon, the couple approached Pablo in the living room to ask for his permission to move out. But as they spoke, a heavy silence filled the room. Pablo's response to the couple was chilling. He said that if Lydia had dared to leave with Leonardo, he would shoot her in the head right before his eyes. The ultimatum was terrifying, but for Lydia, it was even worse. At that moment, she realized that her own father would rather put a bullet in his own flesh and blood than allow her to live independently with her husband. From that point on, things started to go downhill. Starting from the moment that Leonardo confided in his younger brothers, Jean and Analo, at their family home in Santa Mesa, Manila, Leonardo described the suffocating control that his father-in-law wielded over every aspect of their lives. He shared how the man insisted on being present everywhere they went, joining the couple on their dates, sitting beside them at restaurants, and even riding along in their taxis. Records state that on multiple occasions, Pablo would force Lydia to sleep in her mother's room instead of sharing a bed with her husband. Leonardo also recounted the humiliation he felt when he was forbidden from attending Lydia's oath-taking ceremony at her graduation from medical school, insisting he had no right to be there. Hearing this, Jean and Analo exchanged uneasy glances. They recognized how dangerously possessive Pablo had become and urged Leonardo to take precautions. They even suggested he considered getting a gun to protect himself. But Leonardo, ever so patient and hopeful, clung to his faith instead, believing that it would keep them safe. His brothers, though skeptical, understood his resolve. Yet, despite Leonardo's quiet prayers and belief in divine protection, nothing could stop what was coming. As the months went by and the situation became increasingly unbearable, Leonardo made the difficult decision to move out. However, he knew that he couldn't bring Lydia with him. She was too frightened of her father to leave. It was a heart-wrenching choice, knowing he had to leave the woman he loved most in the hands of a man that he believed was dangerously unstable. The thought of abandoning her must have weighed heavily on him, but the reality of Pablo's oppressive rule left him feeling that he had no other choice. And so he packed his things and left. After he left the home on Zapat Street, Leonardo found himself unable to reach Lydia for weeks. Pablo had cut off all means of communication, and Lydia wasn't allowed to leave the house unless she was accompanied by a family member. Her isolation was near total, and any hope of reconnecting seemed out of reach. However, the situation shifted slightly. When Leonardo had learned that Lydia started working at a hospital, giving her a rare glimpse of freedom. Seizing this chance, Leonardo went to visit her, desperate to reconnect. But his hopes were quickly dashed when he arrived, only to find Pablo there, ready to stand between them once again. The records don't explicitly state what happened that day when Leonardo tried to visit, but it's assumed that he wasn't allowed to speak with her and was forced to leave. Undeterred, Leonardo returned the next day, but he was met with heartbreaking news. Lydia had quit her job at the hospital. It's likely that Pablo had forced her to quit and taken her elsewhere, once again, tightening his control over her life. One day, Leonardo finally received news that was both joyful and heartbreaking. Lydia was pregnant. The idea of starting a family with her should have been a moment of pure happiness. Yet that joy was quickly overshadowed by the reality of Pablo's looming influence. Leonardo couldn't help but imagine the iron grip Pablo would try to exert over their child, over their family, crushing any dreams of freedom. However, he was still more determined than ever to support Lydia in any way he could. When Leonardo made his way back to the house on Zapat Street, he found Lydia standing in the backyard. Approaching her, he handed her some money for prenatal care, but he could feel the oppressive weight of Pablo's presence even though he wasn't in the house. Lydia, visibly anxious, shook her head and refused to take the money directly. Instead, she asked Leonardo to send it through the mail, fearing the consequences of being caught accepting his help. Leonardo agreed, but when he mailed the check, it came back to him unopened. He tried again, and each time the check returned to his address in Santa Mesa. This was more than just a rejection. It was Pablo's way of sending a message, a declaration of absolute control. He alone would decide what was best for Lydia and their unborn child, and anyone who tried to interfere would be pushed aside, including the father of the child. After some time, Leonardo received a desperate phone call from his wife. Her voice was frantic as she begged him to come and take her away. Without a moment's hesitation, Leonardo rushed to the house on Zapat Street, where he managed to get Lydia out. Putting her in the car, he drove her towards his home in Cavite, determined to keep her safe from her father's unrelenting control. During the journey, Leonardo called his brothers in Santa Mesa, urgently instructing them to protect their mother. In Leonardo's mind, he couldn't predict what would happen next, but he knew his father-in-law was capable of extreme measures. He likely felt a deep sense of urgency, knowing he had to do everything possible to keep his loved ones safe. A few hours later, a taxi came to a slow stop in front of the family's residence in Santa Mesa. The car door creaked open and out stepped Pablo. The tension was palpable, and his arrival felt like the first dark cloud of an approaching storm. Chaos and confrontation was surely about to unfold. Pablo walked toward the gate, and following closely behind was his wife Asunción. Immediately, Pablo began shouting through the gate, demanding that their daughter be returned. In response, Leonardo's younger brothers hurried out to try to defuse the situation and reason with them, explaining that Lydia wasn't there. She was with Leonardo. However, Pablo was unconvinced and started to grow more furious. Turning around, he walked back toward the taxi, opened a box, and pulled out a submachine gun. Aiming it directly at Jean, he threatened to shoot everyone if his daughter wasn't summoned immediately. With the gun pointed at his face, Jean desperately tried to calm Pablo down, suggesting they move inside to avoid causing a scene in the street. Reluctantly, but ever aware of his public image, Pablo lowered the gun, but made his intentions clear. The family had until midnight to bring Lydia back. If she wasn't returned by then, they'd better have the place guarded by the police. As Lydia's parents left, Jean immediately got into his car and made his way to Cavite. When he arrived, he recounted the terrifying events that had just unfolded in Santa Mesa. He described the moment Pablo had pointed a gun directly at him, the fear that gripped him as he stared down the barrel. Lydia had to be returned by midnight or the consequences would be dire. Overwhelmed and desperate, Lydia had reached her breaking point. Turning to Leonardo, she admitted that throughout her life, she had never been truly happy. She revealed the truth about Pablo's violent temper, saying that all it took for him to turn from smiles to anger was the snap of a finger. At this point, Lydia was in tears, and Leonardo found himself at a complete loss. Caught in the midst of an intense and overwhelming dilemma. However, despite multiple warnings from those around them, Lydia and Leonardo decided to return to the house on Zapata Street. Fearing for the worst, Jean and Leonardo's father, worried but determined to help, offered to accompany them to try and reason with Pablo. When they arrived, the situation was anything but expected. Pablo greeted them with an unexpected warmth. He was all smiles, cheerful, and welcoming, even assuring them that he had no problem with Lydia moving out. It almost felt like a complete 180-degree switch in his personality. Nevertheless, the family was immediately overcome with a sense of relief and joy, believing that perhaps everything had been a huge misunderstanding. Even Lydia and Leonardo were taken aback, though pleasantly surprised. Pablo had said those words in front of everyone, so they felt confident he meant them. It seemed like things might finally be turning around. But that feeling of calm was fleeting because the next morning, the hope they had clung to would take a dark turn. On the morning of January 18, 1961, Pablo reached out to Lydia, who was staying at Leonardo's family home, claiming that her mother had fallen ill and was asking to see her. Lydia knew this game all too well. She recognized it as yet another ploy to lure her back to Zapata Street. Her heart sank, but she also saw this as a chance to gather her belongings and hopefully leave that house for good. Concerned for her safety, Leonardo asked his brothers to go with her. When they arrived at Zapata Street, an eerie silence hung over the house. They found Asunyan lying on the couch, fast asleep. Lydia wasn't fooled. She knew that her mother was feigning her illness and pretending to be asleep. Without hesitation, she headed upstairs to start packing her things, determined to make this her final goodbye. Meanwhile, brothers Jean and Enlo stayed downstairs, trying once again to reason with Pablo, but his grip on Lydia remained as firm as ever. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden crash from upstairs. Pablo excused himself, and a tense, awkward silence filled the room as they waited. Minutes later, he returned with Lydia, who was clutching a crucifix tightly in her hands. Her face was blank, her voice weak as she asked her brothers to leave with Pablo standing ominously by her side. Nonilo tried to insist on staying, but Lydia reassured him, saying she would be fine. But deep down, the brothers knew she wasn't safe. Eventually, Jean and Nonilo returned to Manila and made a call to Leonardo with grim news. Once again, Lydia was trapped in the house on Zapat Street. Furious and determined, Leonardo made up his mind to return immediately. Jean, concerned for his brother's safety, urged him not to go alone. But Leonardo, driven by desperation, ended the call and got ready to leave. Understanding the urgency, Nonilo volunteered to go with him as Jean had to be at work and couldn't join them. Leonardo had reached his breaking point with the man he called his father-in-law. He knew this had to end. He either confronted Pablo now or risked having his life and Lydia shattered forever. When they arrived at Zapat Street, they were greeted by an unusually calm Pablo, who directed Leonardo upstairs. Leonardo silently nodded and made his way up. Pablo remained in the living room with Nonilo, offering him a cup of coffee and making oddly friendly conversation, though the tension was undeniable. Something felt terribly wrong, and Nonilo couldn't shake the feeling off. Moments later, he noticed Asunyan quietly carrying a glass of milk up the stairs and slipping into Lydia's room. The house fell into a heavy silence until suddenly a woman's scream shattered the air, followed by soft, desperate sobs. Nonilo's heart raced as he clutched the coffee cup while Pablo turned to him with a disturbingly casual smile. Then Pablo calmly stood, made his way upstairs, and entered Lydia's room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The silence that followed was suffocating. As Nonilo heard the door click shut, a series of gunshots rang out. In a blur of panic, Nonilo jumped to his feet and bolted out of the house. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. Something horrific had just taken place in that room, and he knew he needed to get help as fast as possible. When the police arrived at the house on Zapat Street, they found it locked and disturbingly silent. Forcing their way inside, the officers stepped up the stairs and into Lydia's room. The entire area had been soaked in blood, and the air was heavy with the acrid smell of gunpowder. In the center of the chaos lay the bodies of Leonardo Katanan and Lydia Cabading, their hands still clasped together in a final embrace. Both Leonardo and Lydia were dead, having been shot right in the chest. Nearby, Pablo Cabading's lifeless body rested on his daughter's bed with a gunshot wound to his head. The officers also found Lydia's mother, Asunyan, gravely wounded, but miraculously still alive. She had been shot in the chest and stomach with the gun lying only a few inches from her feet. Asunyan was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery and miraculously she survived. Asunyan's testimony was the key that helped police reconstruct the horrific events of that night. On that fateful day, in one final violent outburst, Pablo confronted Lydia and Leonardo in the room as they prepared to leave Zapote Street for good. Consumed by rage, he pulled out a gun and shot Leonardo first, then turned the gun on Lydia as she tried to shield her husband. Even this was too far for Asunyan, and she screamed as she attempted to stop him. However, she too became a target of her own husband's fury. Finally, Pablo ended the bloodshed by turning the barrel of the gun on himself and pulling the trigger. In the years that followed, the story of the Cabadating family was immortalized in Philippine literature and cinema. Award-winning Filipino writer and journalist Nick Wim recounted the chilling case in his short story, The House on Zapat Street. This book went on to inspire a film that was released in 1981 called Kisap Mata, which portrays an obsessive father's unyielding hold over his only daughter. Kismata is still considered one of the greatest films in the country to this day, but it was groundbreaking at the time as it was the first film to ever depict incest on screen. Critics have noted that the director had subtly implied a deeply disturbing relationship between the father and daughter, a detail that many believe was central to Pablo's descent into insanity. Nick Wen, the author of the book that inspired this film, supported this by revealing a chilling detail. Unbeknownst to the young couple, Pablo would sometimes hide under their bed as they slept. This fueled rampant speculation, with many believing there was something deeply unsettling happening within the household. Secrets the family had desperately tried to keep hidden. On December 24, 1981, just one day before Kisap Mata was set to premiere at the prestigious Metro Manila Film Festival, a temporary restraining order was filed to halt its screening. The person behind this legal action was none other than Ayan. Remarkably, she had not only survived the fatal shooting, but was still alive nearly 2 decades later. While the true reason behind Pablo's descent into madness remains unknown, theories continue to circulate. Records don't state if Asunyan is still alive today, but if anyone holds the full truth of what happened on Zapat Street, it most probably would be her. However, it appears that some secrets are destined to remain hidden forever. Story 3. It's March 29, 1989. In the city of Tokyo, Japan, the air was heavy with gray clouds hanging low over the skyline. Near the edges of the city, where the bustling streets faded into quieter industrial zones, a group of officers from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department arrived at a barren construction site in Kato City. The officers didn't find themselves here by chance. Earlier that day, a suspect in custody had confessed to something horrific, a crime that had led them to this desolate lot. His instructions were vague. Search for a metal drum near the edge of the construction site, one that was filled with concrete. The officers moved cautiously through the site, their search guided by the chilling confession. Their eyes scanned the ground, picking through piles of rubble and debris. Then one of them stops. His gaze locks on a rusted drum, partially buried beneath the dirt. Its surface is strewn with grime, the metal corroded and pitted, being exposed to the elements. The officer crouches down, brushing away the loose earth with gloved hands. The drum, though battered by time, feels out of place. Its weight, its position. It doesn't look like something discarded at random. The two officers exchange a glance. One of them then reaches out, hesitates, then taps the drum lightly with his hand. The hollow sound that echoes back sent chills down their spines. Immediately, one of them steps back, his breath catching as the realization settles in. This was what they were here for. Inside this concrete drum were the remains of a girl who had been missing for months. Her name was Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old whose disappearance had left her family and community in anguish. But this drum contained more than just her body. It held the truth of a crime so vile it defied human comprehension. For more than 40 agonizing days, Junko Furuta endured a relentless cycle of abuse and violence. She was stripped of her humanity and left to suffer unimaginable pain at the hands of 4 people. But this wasn't the work of seasoned criminals. In fact, the people who had inflicted such brutality on her were teenage boys. They didn't stop with physical abuse. They humiliated her, forced her into unthinkable acts, and even invited others to participate in her suffering. Dozens of people knew what was happening. Some of them watched while others actively participated in her torment. Yet, not a single person stepped forward to intervene. But the most devastating truth was that Junko had come so painfully close to rescue. The police had actually arrived at the very house where she was being held captive. But instead of checking further, the officers turned away, believing the lies they were told. What happened to 17-year-old Junko Furuta was not just a murder. It was a harrowing glimpse into the depths of human cruelty and the apathy of a society that turned its back when she needed help the most. This is a story that continues to haunt those who hear it. Not just because of the horrors that the 17-year-old endured, but for the deafening silence of those who knew what was happening, but chose to look the other way. You're listening to a special edition episode of Hands produced by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Junko Furuta was born on January 18, 1971 in Misadu, a small city in Saitama Prefecture, Japan. Nestled on the outskirts of Tokyo, Misadu was a quiet, unassuming town where life moved at a steady pace. Unbothered by the clamor of the nearby metropolis. It was in this setting that Junko spent her formative years growing up in a modest home with her parents and 2 brothers. An older brother who often acted as a protector and a younger brother who looked up to her with admiration. From a young age, Junko exhibited a quiet determination and a sense of responsibility that made her seem wiser and more mature than her age. Her teachers at Yashio Manamai High School often spoke of her as an exemplary student, dedicated, focused, and rarely absent. She excelled academically and earned the respect of her classmates for her ability to balance her studies with her personal goals. Outside the classroom, Junko was equally driven. In October 1988, she took on a part-time job at a plastic molding factory. Working held a deep significance for her. She likely recognized the hard work her parents had put into raising her, and she wanted to do her part to ease their burden in any way she could. Her dreams extended beyond her small town. Junko had aspirations of becoming an idol singer, a profession that connected her love for music with her desire to inspire others. Though she kept these dreams mostly to herself, those closest to her knew how deeply she cherished the idea of standing on a stage, bringing joy to others through her voice. Like any teenager, Junko faced the usual challenges of adolescence, navigating friendships, and school life. But she handled them with quiet strength and resilience. To her family, she was their source of pride. To her friends, someone you could trust. And to herself, a girl with big dreams and the drive to make them come true. For 17 years, her life was one of hope and potential. A future waiting to unfold. We know that life can be unpredictable, but what happened to Junko next was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. On the evening of November 25, 1988, 18-year-old Hiroshi and 16-year-old Shinji Minato were cruising through the quiet streets of Misadu on their motorcycles. Records state that both teenagers were high school dropouts with several run-ins with the law at the time. Miyano, at 18, exuded a sense of authority, bolstered by his connections to the Yakuza. These ties fueled his arrogance, giving him a reputation as someone untouchable. Meanwhile, his 16-year-old accomplice, Minato, often took on the role of a follower, obediently carrying out Miyano's orders without hesitation. That night, their intent was as dark as the roads they traveled, robbing and preying on unsuspecting women. As they prowled the area, their eyes scanned for a target, searching for someone vulnerable, someone they could overpower. A couple miles away from where the two boys were, Junko Furuta had just finished her shift at the plastic factory. It was late and the cool November air brushed against her face as she pedaled her bicycle through the familiar streets. The route home was one she knew by heart. Each turn she made was a reminder of her routine. The day had been tiring, but it was worth it. She was one step closer to her dreams, and as she made her way home, her thoughts likely wandered to the graduation trip she had been saving so diligently for. It was this sense of purpose that kept her going, even on days when exhaustion crept in. Unbeknownst to Junko, her path would soon intersect with Miyano and Minato, and her world would take an unimaginable turn. From a distance, Miyano spotted her. A lone girl on her bicycle, heading home. She was exactly the kind of target they were looking for. Acting on Miyano's orders, Minato accelerated his motorcycle, swerving close enough to kick Junko off her bicycle. The sudden impact sent her crashing to the ground, her belongings scattering as the two sped off into the shadows. But didn't leave. Instead, he circled back, slowing to a stop near the scene. With Junko still on the floor, he approached her. Appearing concerned, he offered to walk her home. A gesture that seemed kind and protective, perhaps still shaking and vulnerable from the sudden fall. Junko accepted his offer. However, as they walked, subtly guided Junko away from her usual route, leading her toward a desolate area where an abandoned warehouse loomed in the shadows. Junko, still reeling from the earlier attack, likely felt unease creeping in as her surroundings became less familiar. She might have hesitated, her steps slowing. But Miyano's calm demeanor offered a sense of reassurance. Once they reached the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted sharply. Myo's mask of concern dropped, replaced by a cold and menacing presence. His posture stiffened, and his tone turned sharp and commanding. Turning to Junko, Miyano claimed that he was a member of the Yakuza, and if she refused to follow his orders, she would face severe consequences. Trapped and powerless, Junko's options vanished. Before her, she was alone, far from the safety of her home, and in the clutches of someone whose intentions were anything but kind. Fearing for her life, she had no choice but to comply. The moments that followed marked the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would strip away her freedom, her dignity, and eventually her life. After luring Junko into his control, Mayano hailed a taxi and took her to a hotel in Adaka. There, away from any prying eyes, Mayano launched his assault. He raped her repeatedly, exploiting her vulnerability and isolation. In that confined space, Junko was left entirely at his mercy. After committing the assault, Mayano made a call to a man named Joe Agura, one of his closest accomplices. Over the phone, he boasted about what he had done, describing the events in detail. Disturbingly, Agura was excited to hear about this and encouraged Mayano to take things further. He advised him not to release Junko, citing the potential consequences if he were to let her go. He then contacted his other accomplices, Minato and Yasushi Watanabe, to inform them of the situation. Together, the four boys began devising a plan that would become one of the most harrowing crimes in Japan's history. Several moments later, in the early morning hours of November 26, led Junko to a park near the hotel. However, Agura, Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe were already there waiting. Using their knowledge of her home address as leverage, they threatened that the Yakuza would harm her family if she disobeyed their orders and warned that she would face unimaginable consequences if she even considered escaping. Once again, Junko, terrified and powerless, had no choice but to comply. As the group stood in the park, there must have been a brief but deliberate discussion about what to do with her next. Releasing her wasn't an option. Agura had already made it clear that she couldn't be allowed to leave, and the group knew full well the consequences of her going to the authorities. Instead, the conversation shifted to how they could keep her under their control. The boys, emboldened by their twisted intentions, agreed that Junko would be kept for their continued pleasure. But they needed a place somewhere secure and away from prying eyes. It was then that Minato offered up his family's home in Adaka. The second floor room, he said, would provide the privacy they needed to carry out their plans without interruption. With the decision made, Junko was quickly brought to Minato's house. She would remain there for the next 42 days, trapped within those walls. Every single day, she was subjected to unspeakable torment, and her life was now dictated entirely by the cruel and twisted desires of her captors. Meanwhile, a day after Junko had not returned home, her parents had become overcome with worry and filed a missing persons report to the police. It had been 2 full days since their daughter failed to return home, and their concern had grown into fear. Junko wasn't the type to disappear without explanation, and her sudden absence left her family desperate for answers. However, her captors had already learned about the police report and moved quickly. They forced Junko to make a phone call to her mother, not just once, but 3 separate times. On each call, she was forced to assure her family that she had left voluntarily and was staying safely with friends. On the other end of the line, her parents were likely grappling with confusion and disbelief. The Junko they knew would never run away. She was responsible, dependable, and deeply connected to her family. Yet, as much as they wanted to dismiss the possibility, the calls planted a seed of doubt. Could this really be her choice? Was there something they didn't know? Despite these lingering uncertainties, their anxiety and worry for their daughter remained constant. As the situation still felt far from normal, the final call ended with a devastating blow. Under duress, Junko was forced to tell her mother to stop the investigation entirely. it was a cruel manipulation. And for Junko, the act of delivering those words must have been heartbreaking. Surrounded by her captors in an unfamiliar, hostile environment, she had no choice but to betray the very people who were her greatest source of love and safety. In that moment, Junko likely felt a deep, crushing despair. What might have been her only hope had been torn away. With the investigation out of the way, at least for now, the boys realized that they had to strengthen their cover so as to not raise any alarm in the house. Hence, when Minato's parents were present in the house, they instructed Junko to act as though she was Minato's girlfriend. Forced into this charade, she played the role under threat. But her every move was carefully watched by the boys. Minato's parents, initially believing the ruse, did not question her presence. But as days turned into weeks, it was getting harder to ignore that something terrible was happening in Minato's room. Strange noises, muffled cries, heavy thuds, and whispered conversations echoed from behind the closed door of Minato's room, often late into the night. The boys themselves came and went with alarming frequency, sometimes accompanied by other friends. Yet, the door to the second-floor room remained tightly shut. But what was going on inside? The story of Junko Furuta is considered to be one of the most horrifying criminal cases in modern history. And what you're about to hear is an account of the next 42 days of her nightmare. Please be advised that some of the details may be deeply unsettling. When Junko was first brought to the room, the four boys, Hiroshi, Jia, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe had already begun to subject her to relentless abuse. Within those four walls, Junko was repeatedly raped and beaten. However, the assaults were not limited to the initial four boys. They had invited others to join in the abuse. Over the course of her captivity, it is estimated that as many as 100 individuals were aware of Junko's imprisonment, and several of them had participated in her suffering. Reports suggest that she was subjected to sexual assault over 400 times during the 42 days she was held captive. On the night of November 28, the brutality inflicted upon her had immediately escalated to unimaginable levels. That night, the four boys had invited two additional individuals, Tetsuo Nakamura and Ko Hishiera, to join them in their acts of cruelty. Within the confines of Minato's room, Junko was subjected to a horrifying gang rape, with each of the 6 boys taking turns assaulting her. Immediately after the assault, the boys sought new ways to humiliate and degrade her further. Reports state that Minato took a razor blade and shaved her pubic hair. And if this wasn't enough, he then used a lit match to burn her genital area, causing excruciating pain and leaving her with severe burns. Whenever Junko resisted their attacks or attempted to escape, the boys responded with violence. They burned her legs with lighters and dripped hot wax on her face. There were also multiple occasions where they inserted foreign objects into her body, including bottles and metal rods, causing severe internal injuries. There were days when as many as 12 individuals would assault her in a single day. Humiliation became a constant companion as she was forced to remain naked for extended periods. Her vulnerability treated as a source of entertainment by her captors. Some of her abusers even urinated on her, and she was compelled to perform explicit acts for their amusement. She was beaten daily with golf clubs, iron rods, bamboo sticks, and other objects. Dumbbells were constantly dropped onto her body, and her head was repeatedly stomped against the ground. Hot wax was dripped onto her face, especially on her eyelids, which were also burned with cigarettes and lighters. She was deprived of proper food and water, often forced to eat cockroaches and drink her own urine to survive. Her captors even inserted fireworks into her private parts, causing severe burns and damage. In one horrifying incident, one of the boys had grabbed a pair of pliers and tore off her left nipple. In addition to this, she was at times suspended from the ceiling and used as a punching bag. She was also shoved into a freezer and left there for hours. Sewing needles were stabbed into her breasts and left embedded in her skin. Cigarettes and lighters were used to burn her genitals, and in one of the most horrific acts, a lit light bulb was inserted into her body until it shattered. By the end of her ordeal, her face was so swollen and damaged that her features were no longer discernible. Her body emitted the stench of infection and decay as her wounds festered. She was left bleeding heavily from the repeated assaults, wheezing as she struggled to breathe due to blood clogging her sinuses. On New Year's Day in 1989, Junko was unable to move, her body broken, and her spirit crushed. She begged her captors to end her suffering, pleading for death as the only escape from her torment. However, they refused. As the weeks of captivity took their toll on Junko, the extent of her injuries and the deterioration of her appearance began to affect even her captors. The boys no longer found her attractive. Driven by their insatiable cruelty, they turned their focus elsewhere. Using the same strategy that had lured Junko into their clutches, they targeted another unsuspecting victim, a 19-year-old woman on her way home from work. They employed a calculated plan to isolate her, preying on her vulnerability, and proceeded to gang rape her. Not much is known about her identity or what happened to her immediately following the attack. But unlike Junko, this second victim was not held captive. After enduring a horrifying assault, she was freed and allowed to leave. 3 days later, on January 4, 1989, the boys were bored and forced Junko to play a game of mahjong. Despite her condition, she managed to win the game, which enraged the boys. Their retaliation was swift and brutal. Myo began by igniting a candle and allowing the hot wax to drip onto Junko's face. He then grabbed her and placed 2 shortened candles on her eyelids, letting the wax drip down and into her eye sockets. At one point, they lifted her and kicked her with such force that she fell onto a stereo unit. The impact triggered violent convulsions, her body responding to the overwhelming trauma it had endured. Seeing this, the boys began to panic. Desperate to regain control of the situation, they decided to escalate their brutality. To avoid staining their hands with her blood, they covered their hands with plastic bags and proceeded to beat her savagely. Then they dropped an iron exercise ball repeatedly onto her abdomen, causing catastrophic internal injuries. But this was not enough for Mayano. He wanted to take the violence even further. Grabbing a bottle of lighter fluid, he poured it all over Junko's body and set fire with a match. Junko made several weak attempts to extinguish the flames, but her strength was completely depleted after weeks of torture. Eventually, the fire raged on, and she stopped moving. Around 10 a.m. on January 4, 1989, her 42-day ordeal of unimaginable suffering and cruelty had ended. Less than a day later, they devised a plan to dispose of her body in a way that they believed would ensure it was never discovered. They began wrapping her body in blankets, and then placed it inside a large travel bag. This bag was then transported to a construction site in Kato, Tokyo, where they had acquired a 55-gallon metal drum. Using quick-drying concrete, they filled the drum and encased her body inside. Once the drum was sealed, they abandoned it in a vacant lot at the construction site. For nearly 3 months, Junko's body remained hidden in the drum, her family unaware of her fate, and her captors continuing with their lives as though nothing had happened. Unsurprisingly, Miyano and his accomplices continued their criminal behavior, engaging in theft and assault. But sometime in early 1989, Miyano and Agura, both emboldened by their earlier crimes, were arrested in connection with the abduction and gang rape of a 19-year-old woman in December 1988. This was the same victim they had assaulted while Junko was still being held captive in Monato's room. During police questioning, Miyano made a slip of the tongue. Believing that Agura had already confessed to Junko's murder, he panicked and revealed the location of the drum, thinking that his involvement was already known. When police investigated the site described, they found the drum exactly as he had said, partially buried among construction debris. Inside, they uncovered the concrete and case remains of Junko Furuta. This discovery shocked the investigators. The discovery of Junko Furuta's remains was a turning point in the investigation. Once the drum was retrieved and its horrifying contents revealed, the scope of the boy's cruelty became clear. For Junko's mother, the revelation was unbearable. Overcome with grief and shock, she fainted upon hearing the extent of her daughter's suffering. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly, and she required a long-term stay in a psychiatric hospital to cope with the trauma. As part of the investigation, an autopsy was conducted on Junko's remains. According to the report, small glass bottles were found still lodged in her rectal cavity. And it was also discovered that she was pregnant throughout the abuse despite the severe damage to her uterus. Additionally, her face was so mutilated from the repeated assaults that investigators had to rely on her fingerprints to confirm her identity. Following the discovery of the body and the disturbing details from the autopsy, the police moved swiftly to ensure that those responsible faced justice. Confession had set the wheels in motion and the police expanded their investigation to include his accomplices, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, Yasushi Watanabe, and any others who had participated in the crimes. The arrest of the boys swiftly followed, and the news sent shockwaves through their communities. Friends, neighbors, and even their families struggled to connect the horrific acts with the young men. They thought they knew. Police say that over 100 people were believed to have known about Junko's captivity, with some directly participating in the abuse, and yet no one had come forward to help her. The media quickly picked up on the case, dubbing it as the concrete-encased high school girl murder. The details and the sheer length of Junko's ordeal drew national and international attention. Public outrage quickly erupted, with many demanding harsh punishment for the perpetrators and questioning how such acts of inhumanity could have occurred without any intervention. In the weeks following the arrests, the defendants were brought before the court. Because all the main suspects were minors at the time of the crime, their identities were initially protected under Japanese law. However, investigative journalists argued that the severity of their actions stripped them of any right to anonymity. This debate on whether or not to publish their names became a significant point of controversy at the time, but ultimately it became irrelevant as their names and photographs were published anyways. During the trial, the prosecution sought life sentences for the main offenders, emphasizing the calculated and prolonged nature of Junko's suffering. Meanwhile, the defense argued that the boy's actions were influenced by immaturity and a lack of guidance, urging the court to consider rehabilitation over retribution. For Junko's family, attending the trial was a relentless reminder of the suffering she endured. Her parents listened in anguish as the prosecutors detailed the physical and psychological torment inflicted on their daughter. Her mother, already fragile from the grief, often had to leave the courtroom, unable to bear the descriptions of what Junko had faced. The legal proceedings also revealed the roles of Minato's parents, who admitted they had been aware of something amiss, but claimed they were too afraid of their son and his friends to intervene. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that justice, even at its harshest, could never truly atone for what had happened to Junko. In July 1990, all 4 boys were found guilty by the Tokyo District Court for several charges. These include abduction for the purpose of sexual assault, confinement, rape, assault, murder, and the abandonment of a corpse. However, the sentences they received sparked outrage across Japan. Hiroshi, the ringleader, was initially sentenced to 17 years in prison. He then tried to appeal this verdict, but in response, 20 years. His parents were also ordered to pay 50 million yen or approximately $350,000 at the time to Junko's family as compensation. Joe, the boy who told not to let Junko leave in the first place, was sentenced to a term of 5 to 10 years and ultimately served the maximum duration of 10 years. Yasushi Watanabe received a sentence ranging from 5 to 7 years and served the full 7 years. The last boy, Shinji Minato, was handed a sentence of 5 to 9 years. For many, these punishments seemed alarmingly lenient given the extent of the crimes. The lighter sentences were a result of Japan's juvenile justice system, which prioritizes rehabilitation over retribution for offenders under the age of 20. However, this leniency was met with widespread backlash. Critics argued that the severity of the crime far exceeded what the juvenile justice system was designed to handle. The courtroom was inundated with letters and calls demanding harsher sentences, with many expressing disbelief that the perpetrators could one day walk free. The public's anger extended beyond the courtroom. Vigils and protests were held, calling for reforms to the juvenile justice system. Junko's case became a symbol of the inadequacies in addressing violent crimes committed by minors. For her family and supporters, no amount of punishment seemed sufficient to truly reflect the suffering that she endured. Despite the sentences, the release dates of the boys came all too soon for many. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, all 4 had completed their terms. Yasushi Watanabe was released in 1996. Upon leaving prison, he left his hometown to live with his mother. Shinji Minato was released from prison in 1998 and went on to live with his mother. But in 2018, he was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. The incident occurred on a street in Kawaguchi, Saitama, where Minato struck a 32-year-old man in the shoulder with a metal baton and slashed his neck with a knife during a dispute over a parking space. In 2019, he was Sentenced to a year and 6 months in prison with the sentence suspended in probation imposed for 3 years. Joe Aguirre was released from prison in 1999 and subsequently changed his last name to Kamasaku. After his release, he briefly worked in IT, but eventually became involved in organized crime after his past crimes became widely known. In 2004, he was arrested for assaulting Takatoshi Iso, a friend he suspected of being romantically involved with his own girlfriend. Aguirre forced Iso into the trunk of his car and transported him to his mother's bar in Misadu, where he brutally assaulted him for 4 hours. For this crime, Aguirre was sentenced to 4 years in prison and was released in 2009. As for the ringleader, Hiroshi, his parents were left with no choice but to sell their family home in order to provide the compensation of 50 million yen to Junko Furuta's family. After his release in 2009, he changed his last name to Yokoyama. However, it seems that little else about the man has changed. In 2013, he was arrested on suspicion of bank fraud and orchestrating scam telephone calls. But despite the allegations, he refused to cooperate with the authorities and was ultimately not charged. Today, all 4 of the boys who played a role in the unspeakable crimes against Junko Furuta walk free, living their lives beyond the prison walls that once confined them. Furuta's funeral was held on April 2, 1989. It was a day heavy with grief as friends, family, and classmates gathered to say goodbye to a girl who had been taken from them in the most unimaginable way. Among the mourners, one of Junko's friends stood up to deliver a eulogy, a message that was written collectively by her classmates from school. Their words were a tribute to the vibrant life that she had lived and a sorrowful acknowledgement of the cruelty she had endured. Here's an excerpt of that eulogy. Jun-chan, welcome back. I never dreamed we would meet again like this. You were subjected to such cruelty, weren't you? You went through so much, didn't you? I'm upset with myself that I went on living unaware of what was happening. You were always so gentle and cheerful, Jun-chan. The Japanese coat we made for the cultural festival looked wonderful on you. I'll never forget that. We will absolutely not let Junction's death be in vain. As we step into adulthood, we'll strive for a world where such heinous crimes no longer exist. We'll do our best keeping Jun-chan in our hearts and pushing forward. Story 4. It was January 29, 2020. A man on a motorbike rides down a narrow dirt path in the quiet countryside of Vietnam. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of tilled earth and distant wood smoke. There's no reason for anyone to think this night is different, but what happens next will leave 4 people dead and trigger one of the largest manhunts in the country's history. A couple minutes later, he arrives at his destination. He swings his leg off the motorbike, his sandals crunching against the gritty earth. Up ahead, the sounds of laughter, cheers, and the unmistakable clink of coins and rustle of bills reach his ears. Each laugh fans the flames burning inside him. Each cheer a blow to his pride. His hands curl into fists, knuckles white as the memories crash over him. The sting of defeat, the humiliation of their smug faces. The way they laughed when he lost it all. Then from beneath his jacket, he pulls out something cold, heavy, and deadly. Opening the door slowly, he stops just outside the entrance, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. This place, this room, he's been here before. He knows the stale smell of sweat and cigarettes, the faces lit with greedy anticipation. He's even sat at that table clutching the crumpled up dollar bills and chasing the hope of winning big. But in his case, his hope had turned to humiliation. They laughed when he lost. They sneered when he walked away, empty-handed. But tonight, he's not the man who left in shame. Tonight, he's come for payback. The door cracks open wider and heads start to turn toward him. One by one, they freeze. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he prepares to do exactly what he came here for. You're listening to Hands, an Asian true crime podcast brought to you by 1UP Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Sometime in early 2020, a 33-year-old man named Lickwacken steps through a narrow doorway, hidden behind an unassuming storefront in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He's heard whispers about this place, a gambling den where fortunes are won and lost in the span of a heartbeat. Entering the makeshift den, the air is thick with cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of voices mingles with the sharp clink of coins striking porcelain. The most popular game here is called Shaka, or loosely translated as Shake the Plate. Tuan watches closely as a dealer explains the rules. 4 coins, each with a red side and a white side, are shaken beneath the plate. The goal is simple. Place your bet on whether the coins will show more reds or more whites. It sounds straightforward, but almost deceptively straightforward. Arriving at the table, Tuan starts cautiously, placing a small bet. After a few shakes, the dealer lifts the plate to reveal the coins. 2 red, 2 white, he wins. The dealer then sweeps a few crumpled bills into his direction. It's not much, but it's enough to stir something inside him. A spark of hope, a thrill that tingles at the edges of his nerves. He places another bet slightly higher this time. Another shake, another reveal. He wins again and the rush sharpens. A whisper in the back of his mind telling him that maybe, just maybe, this is his chance. Then the pattern shifts. The dealer opens the plate and he loses. Not by much, but just enough to feel a sting. He brushes it off, convinced it was a fluke. He bets again, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table as the dealer shakes the plate. The coins clatter and settle. Another win. Relief washes over him, mingling with excitement. Tuan places another bet, a little higher this time. After all, he has to make up for his losses, doesn't he? But soon, the losses start to outnumber the wins. A tiny flutter of doubt creeps into his mind. He brushes it aside, focusing harder. Tuan convinces himself that each loss is just another step closer to a win. He can almost feel the turn of his luck hovering, just out of reach. The sound of the coins under the porcelain rings in his ears like a taunt. He leans in closer, watching the dealer's every move, searching for clues that aren't there. The plate lifts. The coins flash red and white, and the outcome is revealed. Another loss. As time passes, he places bet after bet, each one pushing the stakes a little higher. But with each loss, the sting grows sharper and the wound cuts deeper. Gambling dens. Like these are pretty common in many parts of Vietnam. They operate quietly, hiding behind storefronts or concealed within older buildings. These are places that you could walk by 100 times, yet never suspect what lies beyond its doors. Of course, the law in Vietnam doesn't tolerate them. Police raids happen frequently, and those caught inside face harsh consequences, like steep fines that can wipe out any of their winnings or even time behind bars. The risk is real, and the price of being caught can be steep. Yet the promise of quick, easy money is a temptation that drowns out all caution. For many who enter these dens, the allure of a jackpot, the thrill of the bet, and the hope of instant fortune eclipses the fear of getting caught. In these places, hope and desperation mix, driving people to keep coming back no matter the risk. In this situation, most gamblers don't think about the risks or consider the consequences. All they see is the game and the hope of a big win. But these places are more than just for gambling. Fortunes are not the only things lost here. Sometimes people lose far more. It was January 29, 2020, the 5th day of the Lunar New Year. The streets of Chu Chi district were quieter than usual. Families gathered in their homes. The sound of laughter and conversation carried on the evening breeze. A sense of celebration and calm lingered in the air. In the rural depths of the Tantan Dong commune, something similar was unfolding. Laughter filled the air, but it was punctuated by occasional bursts of anger and frustration. And on the table, there was more than just hope. There was a lot of money at stake. Concealed within a dense grove of trees stood a makeshift gambling den. It wasn't much, a crude, open-air shelter, tucked away from prying eyes. The canopy of branches provided just enough cover to keep it hidden. Around a worn, rickety table, gamblers were engrossed in their world, their eyes fixed on the dealer's hands, their breaths shallow, and their focus unyielding. Some players stood back, eyes scanning every movement for a hint of advantage. Others leaned in close, their fingers twitching, ready to pounce on the next opportunity. In this isolated pocket of the world, the thrill of chance consumed them. They were locked in a cycle of hope and despair, unaware that their fates were about to collide with something far more dangerous. Among the gamblers stood 33-year-old Le Quoc Thuan, known in the area as Thuan Kai. He had a lean frame, his posture relaxed yet controlled, and a face that gave away little. His expression was always neutral, marked by a calmness that made it hard to read what was going on in his mind. To most, he was just another player, a man quietly placing his bets, unremarkable and easy to overlook. But for those who cared to look closer, there were signs. A tightness in his jaw, a fleeting intensity in his eyes, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the table. As the afternoon dragged on, Tuan was on a losing streak, and his composure began to crack. Luck had turned its back on him, and with each failed bet, the pile of crumpled bills in front of him grew smaller. By now, he had lost nearly 200 million Vietnamese dong, close to $8,000 US. This was an entire year's worth of hard-earned wages, gone in a matter of hours. Each shake of the plate felt like a cruel joke, and the clatter of the coins echoed in his mind. It was as if the game itself was mocking him, telling him that no matter how hard he tried, he would never win. When he started that day, he had likely imagined turning a modest sum into a life-changing haul. But now he watched helplessly as his hopes crumbled, the money slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on. The gamblers around him didn't help either. Some were undoubtedly riding the wave of his misfortune. Their quiet smirks and subtle nods of satisfaction twisted the knife even deeper. Their wins were his losses, and the sting of their silent judgment burned hotter with every passing second. Tuan's patience wore thinner, his breath shorter. The realization struck like a blow. He was running out of money. The sensible choice would have been to walk away, to accept defeat and live to fight another day. But that option was a bitter pill he refused to swallow. The thought of leaving as a failure ignited a fire in his chest. The humiliation, the whispers, the quiet laughter, all of it threatened to consume him. He couldn't let it end like this. There had to be a way out. One more chance, one more bet to make things right. With a sharp breath, he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he punched in the number. When his cousin Min answered, Tuan's voice was low and firm. Min, listen to me. Go to my mother's house. There's 100 million there. I need you to bring it to me. Don't ask questions. Just do it. I can't leave like this. I'm not walking away a loser. Hurry and don't tell anyone. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt oppressive. Tuan had drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back. His pride, his desperation, his simmering rage, they all merged into a singular, relentless drive. One way or another, he was determined to change his fate. But with every bet, he edged closer to the moment when everything would finally and violently break. 100 million Vietnamese dong is almost $4,000. This was a huge chunk of cash, way more than most people would ever dream of betting all at once. But for Tuan, this was no longer about the money. It had become far more personal. Tuan's cousin Min finally showed up with the money. But as he took the cash and added it to his stack, the reality didn't shift. He placed bet after bet, but the losses, they kept rolling in. After a few consecutive losses, Tuan was once again running out of money. The mood around the table shifted. The friendly banter soured, replaced by grumbles and sharp remarks. The tension grew. Tuan's frustration bubbled over, and he started snapping at the other gamblers. Maybe it was their smug comments or the way they laughed while he kept losing. Whatever it was, it lit a spark inside him. Then, without a word, Tuan pushed back from the table. His movements were swift, almost mechanical. His expression gave nothing away. But his eyes, they blazed with something dangerous, something beyond frustration. He turned on his heel and walked out, his steps pounding with barely contained fury. Moments later, the roar of his motorbike tore through the quiet grove as he sped off into the humid afternoon. To the other gamblers, it probably looked like nothing more than the tantrum of a sore loser who couldn't handle defeat. But for Tuan, this wasn't surrender. It was a calculated retreat. As he vanished down the dusty path, something dark churned inside him. Eventually, the man who had walked away empty-handed returned, but not with more cash or another desperate bet. He came back with an AK-47 strapped to his back, pointing the barrel of the gun towards the table. The first shot exploded into the air, and a deafening crack shattered the tense stillness of the den. The closest gambler barely had time to react before he crumpled to the ground, his chair clattering loudly as it toppled with him. In that instant, the room descended into chaos. Screams erupted, sharp and panicked. Players lunged in every direction, desperate to escape. A man shoved away from the table, eyes wide with terror, his feet slipping on the debris. Another gambler, fueled by blind desperation, rushed toward Tuan in a last-ditch effort to stop him. But Tuan's movements were cold and precise. He raised the AK-47 and fired again. The second shot slammed into the man who fell mid-stride, his body hitting the ground with a lifeless thud. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the den, ripping through flesh and splintering wood. And then, just as quickly as it began, the gunfire ceased. Four men lay motionless, their bodies draped over the makeshift table and sprawled across the dirt floor. Two more gamblers groaned weakly, clutching their wounds, their eyes glazing over as the life ebbed from them. Tuan stepped forward and surveyed the devastation he had just unleashed. His gaze settled on one of the victims, named Huan Nak Min Tuang, whose lifeless body was slumped over a scattered pile of cash. The sight of the money brought no hesitation. Tuan reached down, his fingers sweeping up the crumpled bills, 802 million Vietnamese dong, and stuffed them into a waiting bag. With the gun still slung across his back, he walked back towards his motorcycle, swung his leg over the seat, and kick-started the engine. Without looking back, Tuan sped off, leaving behind a scene soaked in death and blood. What he set in motion that day unleashed one of the largest manhunts Vietnam had ever seen. When 33-year-old Le Quoc Twin left the den, the place had become eerily silent, save for the faint cries of the wounded and the hushed, disbelieving murmurs of survivors. Four men lay dead where they had been seated moments earlier, their lifeless bodies sprawled over the gambling table, stained with blood. Nearby, two others clutched their wounds, their faces contorted in agony, barely holding on. The survivors, frozen in shock, stood at a distance, struggling to process the horrific scene that had just unfolded. Among them, someone made the call to the police. A trembling voice on the other end of the line, desperately recounting the unimaginable carnage. Meanwhile, Tuan sped away on the stolen motorbike, its engine roaring as he disappeared into the dense rural landscape. In his bag was more than 800 million Vietnamese dong in cash, or around $32,000. These were the blood-stained spoils of his rampage. When authorities received the call, their response was swift. Officers from multiple specialized units were quickly mobilized, racing toward the scene. Heavily armed and on high alert, they didn't know what awaited them, whether the shooter might still be nearby or if the situation could escalate further. Within minutes of their arrival, investigators began their work. They sifted through the scene, cataloging every detail. The shattered remnants of the gambling setup, discarded belongings, and bullet-riddled surfaces. Security cameras from nearby roads were reviewed. And while the footage varied in quality, one critical image stood out. A grainy capture of the shooter moments after the massacre. He was riding the stolen motorbike, his face partially obscured by a mask and cap, clad in a black jacket, blue shorts, and sandals. He seemed unremarkable, but to the officers, this was their target, an armed, dangerous fugitive capable of unthinkable violence. As the investigators delved deeper into the identity of the shooter in the footage, a chilling detail came to light, one that sent shockwaves through the task force. This wasn't just any armed fugitive. His name was Lwok Tuan, a former police officer. The man they were hunting had once worn the very uniform of those now chasing him. Tuan had been trained in combat, armed tactics, and evasion. Skills that now made him an even deadlier adversary. For the officers pursuing him, this wasn't just a manhunt. It was a race against someone who knew exactly how they worked, how they thought, how they moved, how they hunted. For the next few days, Tuan's whereabouts were a complete mystery. His trail seemed to have vanished almost as soon as it had appeared, leaving investigators grasping for leads and the community gripped with unease. But Tuan wasn't actually lying low or hiding. Every moment was spent calculating his next move, taking deliberate steps to outmaneuver the authorities and stay one step ahead of the tightening net around him. Reports suggest that after fleeing the scene, Tuan sought refuge at the home of an accomplice named Farm Tantum, known better as Farm. At his house, Tuan handed over a portion of the stolen money, instructing him to pass it along to his wife. It might have been a desperate attempt to secure his family's future, even as his own life spiraled further into chaos. Yet, Tuan didn't linger for too long here. Very quickly, he abandoned the stolen motorbike he had used to escape the gambling den, knowing it could lead the authorities directly to him. He then set off on foot, traveling through the dense rural paths of Koakai under the cover of darkness. Somewhere along the winding trails, Tuan came across a local couple riding a motorbike. Tran knocked Ben and his wife. At first, the encounter might have seemed harmless. A lone man walking along the roadside. But as Tuan approached, he brandished his weapon, and in an instant, the couple's world was turned upside down. With cold, calculated determination, Tuan ambushed them. The rifle slung threateningly over his shoulder. Paralyzed with fear, the couple had no choice but to comply. They surrendered their motorbike without resistance, helplessly watching as Tuan sped off with their vehicle before disappearing into the night. The stolen motorbike carried Tuan deeper into the countryside, but even he must have realized that his trail was becoming more obvious with every move. The couple would surely report the theft, which would only give the authorities more clues on his whereabouts. Therefore, Tuan's next move was calculated. He approached a canal in the Phu Hoadong commune, a secluded shadowed stretch of water surrounded by dense vegetation. Stopping the motorbike, he tipped it into the water without hesitation. As the vehicle disappeared beneath the murky surface, Tuan plunged into the canal himself, swimming across with the rifle and stolen money and tow. Emerging on the other side, dripping and weary, he pressed forward into the darkness, his thoughts likely consumed by the growing realization that time was running out. Emerging on the opposite bank, Tuan made his way to the home of another trusted ally, Vihung Tam. For Tuan, this stop was more than just a hiding place. It was a moment to regroup and consider his next steps while the police closed in from all sides. Tam opened the door to find Tuan standing there, soaked and carrying the weight of desperation. The conversation between the two must have been brief and tense. There was no time to waste. They began strategizing immediately, working out how to evade the tightening noose of law enforcement. Soon, one of Tuan's cousins, Tan, joined them, and together, the three men exchanged ideas and devised contingency plans. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Recognizing the growing danger of harboring a fugitive, Tam decided to distance himself. Early the next morning, he packed what he could and left for Dong Nai province, leaving Tuan and his cousin to fend for themselves. However, it wasn't long before his cousin Tan chose to return to a relative's house in Phu Hoa commune. Whether he was trying to establish an alibi or simply distance himself from the escalating chaos, his departure marked a shift in the fragile network around Tuan. Alone once again, Tuan faced the crushing reality of his circumstances. The countryside was no longer a safe haven. Villages were under heightened surveillance with police checkpoints and roadblocks popping up on nearly every path. Patrols combed the area relentlessly, leaving him with fewer options and no room for error. His cousin Tan, who was still attempting to help Tuan from afar, reached out to a local friend known for his mechanical skills and dependability. The idea was to use his friend's motorbike to get Tuan to a safer location. At first, he had agreed, but the plan quickly fell apart. The getaway motorbike had broken down, rendering the escape attempt futile. Frustrated, but determined, they pivoted to another idea, hiring a taxi. But during their discussions, a new obstacle presented itself. Ten had noticed that Tuan was still carrying the AK-47 rifle, the very weapon used in the murders. They all knew that transporting the rifle in one piece would be far too risky, which is why Tan advised Tuan to disassemble it, hoping that doing so would reduce suspicion if they were stopped. But even with this adjustment, the plan never materialized. Communication with Tuan became increasingly sporadic, and eventually everyone involved recognized the rising danger and abandoned the plan entirely. Time was slipping away, and Tuan's desperation was palpable. His sanctuary at Tom's house no longer felt secure. The once quiet countryside was now a hive of law enforcement activity with roadblocks, helicopters, and constant patrols, leaving him with nowhere to hide. Even those who had initially supported him began to falter. The risk of aiding a fugitive weighed heavily on them. By now, it was clear that Tuan's time was running out. On February 13, 2020, nearly 2 weeks after the massacre, police received a tip that would change everything. They managed to confirm Tuan's location. He was hiding in a friend's house. The response was immediate. Over 500 personnel from various law enforcement agencies mobilized, descending on the area in a coordinated operation. This was it, the moment the manhunt had been building toward. The officers approached cautiously, knowing the danger they faced. Tuan was armed, volatile, and cornered, a lethal combination. As the task force surrounded the house, the air grew heavy with tension. Officers moved silently, their weapons drawn, their steps deliberate. Every creak of a boot on gravel, and every faint rustle seemed amplified, a reminder of the danger lurking within. Everyone knew what the man was capable of. After all, he had already killed 4 people. What were a few more lives to him? Inside the house, Tuan must have felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had evaded capture for nearly 2 weeks, but now the walls were closing in. Perhaps he listened to the faint murmurs outside, the occasional crackle of a police radio. Whatever his thoughts, he knew this was the end of the road. Cornered, armed, and desperate, Tuan prepared to make his last stand. For the officers outside, every second dragged like an eternity. This wasn't just an ordinary arrest. It was the culmination of a manhunt that had captivated the nation, and it could end in a bloodbath. Then it began. The stillness of the countryside shattered as Tuan opened fire. His AK-47 erupting in deafening bursts. Bullets tore through the night, splintering wood and ricocheting off surfaces. The officers returned fire with precision, their movements deliberate as they sought cover and maneuvered for position. For several minutes, the firefight raged on with the cacophony of gunfire reverberating through the rural landscape. The flashes of light from the barrel of Tuan's rifle illuminated the scene in brief, chaotic intervals. Each burst was a grim reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a capture. It was survival. Then, as quickly as it began, the gunfire ceased. The officers moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the lingering haze of smoke and dust. Inside the house, they found Tuan slumped against the wall, his lifeless body bearing the marks of the intense firefight. The AK-47 lay just inches from his hand. But the threat had ended. With Tuan's death, the immediate danger was neutralized, but the manhunt's conclusion left behind a wave of questions and a nation grappling with the aftermath. The massacre at the gambling den was only the beginning of a much darker revelation. As investigators sifted through evidence and conducted interviews, they uncovered a chilling web of criminal connections, an intricate network of illegal arms smuggling that had enabled Tuan's violence. The AK-47 he had used wasn't just any weapon. It was part of a cache smuggled into Vietnam from neighboring Cambodia, orchestrated by a criminal syndicate deeply entrenched in the region. One name stood out. Pham Tam, the same man who had initially harbored Tuan. After the massacre, Tam wasn't just an accomplice. He was a central figure in the smuggling operation. In 2018, Tam had traveled to Cambodia where he acquired firearms, ammunition, and grenades, smuggling them back into Vietnam. Over the next year, these weapons changed hands multiple times, passing through various members of the network before finally reaching Tuan. Among them was the AK-47 with over 100 rounds of ammunition, the same rifle that turned the gambling den into a bloodbath. With Tuan's death, law enforcement shifted their focus to dismantling the network. Raids were conducted, arrests were made, and a clearer picture began to emerge of the criminal infrastructure that had armed him. The fallout from Tuan's rampage extended far beyond the immediate victims. The families of those killed at the gambling den were left to mourn their devastating losses. While the survivors grappled with the trauma of that fateful day, the broader investigation exposed the cracks in Vietnam's enforcement against illegal gambling and armed smuggling. Public outcry demanded answers. How could someone like Tuan, a former police officer, have access to such deadly firepower? And how had the criminal networks flourished unchecked for so long? As the dust settled, the legal system began addressing those who had aided Tuan. Among them, Pham Ton Tam faced charges of aiding and abetting. along with several others connected to the smuggling ring. For Vietnam, the saga of Lquan was more than the tale of a gambler turned killer. It was a painful reminder of the desperate measures a person could resort to when consumed by pride, loss, and the illusion that violence could reclaim what fate had taken away. The countryside of Cu Chi eventually returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of that January evening would linger for years to come. Story 5. It's 5 p.m. on the 6th of January, 2016. We're inside the Grand Indonesia shopping mall in Jakarta. A big mall right in the center of the city. Picture lots of shoppers strolling around, their faces lit up with excitement. That's the vibe you get here. At the Olivia Cafe inside the mall, a young woman occupies a booth, her gaze fixed expectantly as she awaits the company of her friends. The cafe is fitted with nice wooden tables, comfy cushioned booths, and every corner is filled with lush green plants, creating a refreshing and calming atmosphere. It's also a pretty upmarket cafe because it often attracts a crowd of well-to-do folks who appreciate the finer things in life. But our focus is on a booth where a 27-year-old woman named Jessica Wango is sitting. Her eyes appear to be fixed on the entrance, and she's leaning forward a bit, eager for her friends to arrive. Fast forward to 5:16 p.m. and seated around the table were three women, Mna Saline, Jessica Wango, and their mutual friend, Hani. Their iced beverages rested in their hands as they engaged in conversation and shared laughter that echoed with delight. But amidst all the activity, an imminent tragedy was silently biding its time. The events of the next hour would set into motion a chain of events that would summon ambulances and police vehicles while also attracting news reporters from far and wide. I heard this first from my mom. So, my mom sent me one of those, chain text messages, and it has Mna's picture, and it's kind of like the headline of the text was something about, "Oh, this young girl. She died of a heart attack from mixing diet pills." Something like that. The reunion of the three women were all captured on CCTV cameras that were installed in the cafe. The muted and grainy video shows Mna settling into her seat after sharing a warm hug with a longtime friend Jessica. Soon after, Mna eagerly grasped her favorite Vietnamese iced coffee and indulged in a sip. But immediately, her facial expression changed into a grimace, a clear display of disgust or shock. Mna took a sip. She said, "Oh, why does it taste weird?" Sensing that the iced coffee had an unusual taste, she signals to her friend Hani and asks if she'd like to give it a try. She kind of put the straw on the tip of her tongue and she said that her tongue tingled. And then not long after, you can see Mna she looked like she was a little bit out of it. She was spitting herself, and then she threw her head back right there, and then CCTV cameras capture Mna's head jerked back involuntarily as if struggling against an unseen force. It was a heart-wrenching moment and a difficult scene to witness as Mna slumped into her seat, convulsing and foaming at the mouth for several agonizing minutes. Amid the turmoil, urgency prevailed and an ambulance was swiftly summoned to the cafe with sirens wailing in the background. Nasalahin was taken away. The ambulance raced through the city streets with flashing lights cutting through the evening gloom as it navigated its way to a hospital in central Jakarta. But it's too late. Mna Salahin was pronounced dead at 6 p.m. Her fight has come to an end. Those sentiments you hear were voiced by one of the early members of a Facebook group named Justice for MNA. In an exclusive conversation with the heinous team, she delves into a personal bond with Ma Salihin, sharing perspectives about her personality and shedding light on the truth behind MNA's death. Respecting her wish for anonymity, we will refer to her as Jane. It wasn't easy for Jane to open up about details surrounding the case, but at the core of her intention is a strong desire to unveil the true story behind MNA's death, because 28-year-old MNA Salihin did not die due to a mere accident, but a meticulously orchestrated act of murder. You're listening to a special feature episode of Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast produced by One Up Media. MNA Salihin was born in 1988. She was the daughter of a prominent businessman named Eddie Salihin. Eddie had occupied a distinguished title as a thriving and accomplished businessman in the world of Jakarta's plastics industry. He made his fortune exporting plastic goods all around Southeast Asia and Australia. He was widely recognized as the titan of the plastics packaging industry. In fact, records state that at one point in time, he was the #1 exporter of plastic goods in Australia. It therefore comes as no surprise that such a flourishing business led to considerable wealth. While Eddie stood as a formidable figure in the business world, his heart softened when it came to his children. Among them, Ma shared an unbreakable bond with her identical twin sister Sandy and their younger sibling, all cherished equally by their doting parents. As is often the case in wealthy families, the children basked in an abundance of affection, toys, and indulgences, a lifestyle that might be deemed privileged by many people. Some might even call them spoiled. Here's what Jane had to say. I can only share what I know about MNA. And I believe there are things that some listeners or people who are interested in the case may not know about MNA. I mean, she's been painted as this perfect socialite from Jakarta, Indonesia. But she is so much more than that. When you say the word socialite, you may think that she's pretentious. So, I would like to just, share what I know. I know that MNA is super sweet. She's caring. She's blunt. She's also very artistic. She's just a really beautiful soul. I can say that she is. Jane and Ma's friendship has weathered the passage of time, an endearing connection forged over many years. Though life's currents have gently led them down separate paths, the echoes of their shared journey still ripple in their memories. They initially crossed paths during their childhood years. We share the same passion. How close I am, like on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say I'm about 6 or 7 with MNA. Based on what Jane told us and several accounts found on various online sources, MNA's formative years were characterized by a sense of contentment and an abundance of joy. She figured out early in life that she had always wanted to become a graphic designer. And so after graduating high school, she enrolled in the Billy Blue College of Design in Sydney, a prestigious institution renowned for its significant contributions to the realm of design education in Australia. MNA was often seen with a group of fellow students who, like her, originated from Indonesia. This allowed her to form a close-knit bond with her peers, creating a circle of friends within the college community. One of MNA's friends during her college years was Jessica Kumalawango, a fellow Indonesian with whom she formed a profound bond. Right before graduation, Jessica had envisioned a future of living in Australia and even had her Australian citizenship application approved. MNA, on the other hand, wanted to return to Indonesia after completing her studies with a clear goal of finding a job and starting a family with her longtime boyfriend, Arif Samako. As the school term concluded, MNA along with some other friends headed back to Indonesia while Jessica remained in place, fully embracing the course she had charted for herself. So, looking at the history between both of them and Jessica's history when she was living in Sydney, you can kind of make up a small impression of what Jessica's character is like. What does Jane mean by that? Well, it turns out that MNA was actually reluctant to meet Jessica at the cafe that day. And the reason behind this boiled down to her genuine fear of Jessica. In fact, she was so scared of her that she felt compelled to enlist the company of her friend Haney to tag along to the cafe. It might come as a surprise given their past as best friends during their university years. Back then, their bond seemed unbreakable. But as we uncovered more about Jessica's concerning past, it would seem that their relationship was tumultuous. After the pair ventured down separate paths following their graduation, MNA found herself drawn back to Sydney in 2014. Motivated by a desire to rekindle the connection she made with her former college friends. Jessica must have missed MNA dearly because after she heard about her arrival in Sydney, she swiftly invited her to dinner. Their much-anticipated reunion was thoughtfully set against the backdrop of a charming restaurant. And as they sat across from each other, they shared laughter and stories that bridged the gap of time. Yet, what started as a lovely dinner soon culminated into a heated argument. During dinner, Jessica confided in MNA about relationship troubles she was having with her then boyfriend, Patrick O'Connor. In response, MNA candidly expressed her disapproval of Patrick, urging her to consider leaving him. Throughout the conversation, Jessica was silent. It was assumed that she couldn't believe MNA, one of her closest friends, was actually telling her to part ways with someone who held a significant place in her heart. When MNA eventually finished her sentence, Jessica abruptly rose from her seat, left her unfinished meal behind, and departed the restaurant without saying goodbye. Following the dinner, a sense of unease settled within MNA. She confided in her fiancé, Arif, expressing her reservations about meeting Jessica alone in the future. She decided that she would never want to meet Jessica again, at least not alone, and any subsequent encounter would involve the presence of a companion. Either Arif or their mutual friends, Hani or Vera. In November of 2015, a mere 5 months after their encounter in Sydney, MNA embarked on a new chapter of her life by exchanging wedding vows with Arif. The couple's wedding was held in Bali, and it was nothing short of a fairy tale spectacle. It was evident through photos and videos that the couple had spent a considerable sum of money on the decorations, venue, and food. Yet, amid the splendor and grandeur, MNA made the decision not to extend an invitation to Jessica. Records state that when Arif asked her about it, she casually waved it off, expressing that she wasn't comfortable having Jessica around and wanted to avoid any potential issues on their big day. However, she did invite other friends, such as Hani and Vera, whom she met through Jessica and Sydney. While it may appear that MNA holds a negative role in this narrative, let's consider Jane's perspective. What I did mention over again and again is that MNA is very she speaks her mind. But it's of a good intention, I would say. You know, she doesn't overthink, whereby we overthink too much. But for MNA, she sees things in a way where it's so simplified, like, why don't you just do this? You know what I mean? That'll solve the problem. So, she's very direct. But that's what makes MNA MNA. That's how we know her. Straightforward, candid, but sincere. That was MNA's character. It's likely that her straightforwardness regarding Jessica's relationship might have caused her to abruptly leave the restaurant in a fit of anger that evening. She was 27. At the time, 27-year-old. Could have passed away without, you know, like any prior health issues. We couldn't even comprehend it in the beginning. In stark contrast to Na's life, Jessica's was on a different path marked by its own set of challenges and uncertainties, and quite a few of them. In 2015, Jessica was living alone in her Sydney apartment. And within the span of just a year, her life took a distressing turn. As she found herself hospitalized on 5 different occasions, each stemming from her struggles with failed suicide attempts and incidents of self-harm. In January, Jessica's boyfriend, Patrick O'Connor, called the police on Jessica after she had threatened to kill herself with a knife. In August of the same year, Jessica found herself under the influence of alcohol and behind the wheel of her Audi Q3 when it veered off course, collided with a curb, and crashed forcefully through a brick wall, stopping just before the bedrooms of a nursing home. The accident stirred many of the nursing home's residents, turning the scene into chaos. It even garnered the attention of a local news camera crew. Among the captured footage was an injured Jessica laying within the confines of an ambulance. Although her Audi looked wrecked beyond repair, Jessica emerged with only a handful of cracked ribs and a smattering of bruises. 2 months later, Patrick calls the police again. This time telling them that Jessica had started a small barbecue inside her bedroom and shut off all the windows, sealing herself inside and inhaling as much carbon monoxide as possible in an attempt to end her own life. 2 weeks after this, police were called yet again to Jessica's apartment. This time, they found an empty whiskey bottle next to her bed with 3 handwritten letters, one of them pointing a damning finger at Patrick O'Connor as the reason behind her suicide. The remaining letters meant for her family and workplace bore the weight of farewell in the form of somber suicide notes. By late November, Patrick's patience reached its limit, and he filed a restraining order against Jessica. Patrick mentioned receiving regular voice and text messages from Jessica where she threatened self-harm. She also persistently messaged Patrick's friends and family when he was unavailable. Jessica's situation worsened in 2017. She lost her job as a graphic designer and faced a court trial for DUI. At this low point, with limited prospects in Sydney, she chose to return to Jakarta, hoping for a new beginning. Prior to her departure, Jessica created a WhatsApp group chat and added some friends she made from her time at Billy Blue. Among the members of this group chat was MNA. And although she did not immediately reply, she ultimately accepted Jessica's invitation to have dinner together. And so on December 12, 2015, MNA, accompanied by her newlywed husband, Arif, joined Jessica for an evening meal at a restaurant in North Jakarta. During this occasion, MNA and Arif chose to disclose to Jessica that they had recently tied the knot. It's hard to grasp the impact of such news on someone as downtrodden as Jessica. But what was certain was that the mood had shifted to one of discomfort. A few days after this, another message from Jessica arrives in the WhatsApp group. This time inviting the group of girls to meet up and catch up at a cafe in January. However, what struck as peculiar was her abrupt shift in behavior. She appeared to be extra generous and friendly. The WhatsApp conversation history between the girls revealed that she had offered to arrange a reservation and went above and beyond by generously offering to shoulder the expenses for their upcoming gathering. MNA asks where they should meet, to which Jessica immediately replies, Olivia. MNA then says, oh yeah, delicious. I love their Vietnamese iced coffee. So, what I know was that this was not long after Jessica went back to Jakarta. She wanted to meet up with MNA. But MNA was, this is what I gathered from our friends, the news articles. What I've been told is that MNA did not feel comfortable meeting Jessica because the last time they met, they did not end on a good note. Basically, when they last met, it was not a great experience for both of them. So that's why MNA brought Honey, her friend, their mutual friend, along with them. The one thing that I know is that Jessica arrived at the cafe hours early. Seems like she was scouting the area to find like the best seat in the cafe to where it's out of the CCTV view. And then I remember, because I watched the CCTV as well. She left for a little bit. She came back with Bath and Body Works shopping bags. And then she came back, ordered drinks. She insisted on ordering drinks and then Honey and Ma came. MNA took a sip. She said, oh, what does it taste weird? What does it taste weird? It's around 5:20 p.m. at the Olivia Cafe, and everyone is panicking. The waiters and the manager hurried over to offer assistance. Honey calls out to MNA, attempting to wake her from an unresponsive state. Yet, Jessica remains seated, seemingly indifferent to the unfolding turmoil. As the first responders rushed to help MNA, Jessica turned and said to the manager, what did you put in the coffee? Given the context of the situation and the fact that they were in the midst of a crisis, focusing on what was in the coffee seemed oddly suspicious. In response, the manager instructed the waiting staff to preserve the remaining portion of MNA's coffee rather than dispose of it. This seemingly innocuous action would later prove to be a pivotal element of evidence in this case because it was what was discovered in the coffee that killed MNA. So, I think they already knew. They already found the reason. They found cyanide in Ma's system and they did find cyanide in the coffee. I think we immediately agreed that MNA is healthy. There's no way that this healthy, she was 27 at the time, 27-year-old, could have passed away without any prior health issues. So, we knew that something, if it was heart attack, it would have been really surprising. But then to find that it was cyanide, it was even we couldn't even comprehend it in the beginning. In Indonesia, a predominantly Muslim country, securing consent for an autopsy on MNA to figure out her cause of death was a task that required considerable persuasion. This was further complicated by Islamic beliefs which dictate that the deceased should be buried promptly, ideally within 24 hours of death. It took a little bit of time for MNA's family to agree to an autopsy. I did Recall an interview with This Is MNA's dad at a news station where MNA's dad, he was still hesitant. He did admit that. He was hesitant. He did not know if he wanted to go through with the autopsy. So, he actually went to MNA. He kissed her forehead and just apologized to her to tell her that I'm so sorry, but we have to send you for autopsy. Cyanide is a rapidly acting and deadly chemical that interferes with the body's ability to use and preserve oxygen. And it doesn't take a big amount to kill an adult human. In fact, about 120 to 150 mg of liquid cyanide is all it takes to kill a man within minutes. Thanks to the manager of the Olivia Cafe, who had preserved MNA's drink, police confirmed that MNA's cup of coffee had indeed been laced with a lethal dose of cyanide. Subsequently, Jessica Wong So emerges as the number one suspect. There was never really a doubt in my mind. If you look at the CCTV, you can tell it was really suspicious. So to me, the CCTV made it really clear. On January 30th, 3 weeks after MNA's death, Jessica was arrested. This captured the attention of reporters all over Indonesia as well as internationally. It was a sensational breakthrough in the case, and cameras were following Jessica everywhere she went. Interestingly, when faced with the glare of the cameras, Jessica's demeanor exuded an air of calm and poise marked by a serene smile. This would be a recurring theme throughout the course of Jessica's trial. She was often seen smiling and waving with an extremely calm composure. I feel like the minute you Google MNA's name, like a bunch of articles popped up. I would say within a week, there was already a lot of news, a lot of interviews. They're trying so hard to get to interview people. Despite how much she seemed to enjoy the attention, Jessica was consistent in her statements to the police that she had no involvement in Ma's poisoning. But after 2 days' worth of psychological evaluations, the police concluded that Jessica was on the surface a smart, calm, and confident person. However, she had the personality of an amorous narcissist. These types of people thrive on being the center of attention and show a complete lack of remorse. They resort to lying and deceit in pursuit of their desires. Jessica was the main suspect. It was pretty immediate. I almost want to say she was the prime suspect from the get-go. To me, it's very senseless. It's basically murder. There's no reason for you to give someone cyanide. So, why did Jessica want to kill MNA? Well, the truth is no one knows for sure. But numerous theories have surfaced, ranging from the more plausible to the less credible. Some say that Jessica had feelings for MNA, and the prospect of losing her to marriage became an overwhelming burden. The theory is that if Jessica couldn't have MNA, she wouldn't allow Arif to have her either. Nonetheless, Jessica consistently denies any claims regarding her romantic feelings for MNA. During our interview with Jane, she gives an alternative theory on why Jessica could have wanted MNA dead. A lot of things were circulating. I did mention previously there was someone making up a story saying that Jessica is in love with MNA. But Sandy actually did an interview and Sandy was saying she's jealous. She's jealous of MNA because things were going well for MNA. She got married. Things were indeed going well for MNA. She just had a fairy tale wedding and was planning to start a family of her own. In contrast, however, Jessica faced a string of setbacks, including getting fired from a job and several legal issues because MNA told her to break up with the boyfriend. And it seems like she held this grudge, thinking that all these bad things that happened to me, it's all because of MNA. So, that's most plausible in our minds. On the 15th of June 2016, 6 months after MNA's death, Indonesia's trial of the century began at the Central Jakarta State Court. Rows of news reporters and arrays of cameras adorned the courtroom's perimeter, while across the nation, many remained glued to their TV screens to watch the drama unfold. The trial began with the prosecution accusing Jessica of premeditated murder, urging the court to impose the death penalty. They brought in a parade of witnesses to testify, including MNA's dad, Eddie, who took the stand and recounted how Jessica was acting strange at the hospital on the day of MNA's death. He stated that Jessica was unusually composed and calm despite having just witnessed her friend's tragic death. He also mentioned that Hani, on the other hand, was visibly shaken and in tears. Then Samay Kako, MNA's newlywed husband, testified about her relationship to Jessica, saying how MNA would feel uncomfortable around her ever since the altercation at the restaurant in Sydney. The prosecution went so far as to call upon Sandy, MNA's twin sister, whose testimony revealed something astonishing. She claimed to have overheard Jessica utter the words, "I'm sorry," after MNA was officially declared dead at the hospital. In the face of these first-hand accounts, it probably wouldn't have been easy for Jessica to come up with a defense. In the third month of the trial, Jessica's defense team fired back. It began with an Australian forensic pathologist explaining that MNA's passing might not have been a result of cyanide poisoning. He said that there were no traces of cyanide found in MNA's gastric fluid, which was taken 70 minutes after her death, while the 0.22 grams of cyanide found in her stomach was taken a few days after her death and was therefore likely to have been produced post-death. Another forensic pathologist agreed and explained that MNA's true cause of death could only be confirmed after conducting a full autopsy, but in this case, they only took samples of her tissues and fluids. This loaded up the rounds for Jessica's legal gun. A team of lawyers made it clear that MNA's death was not necessarily caused by cyanide poisoning. They suggested that MNA could have had an unknown pre-existing medical condition that might have played a role in her death. Additionally, they also pointed out that the prosecution couldn't prove where the cyanide came from. Then it was time for Jessica herself to testify, and when she took to the stand, the courtroom was dead silent. Again, she's calm and collected, occasionally smiling as she denies all claims of poisoning and implores the judges to base their verdict on concrete evidence rather than speculation. Amidst the ongoing exchange of arguments between the prosecution and defense, a crucial aspect comes into focus: the CCTV footage. This, coupled with MNA's preserved coffee cup, emerged as the most crucial pieces of evidence in this case. The one thing that I know is that Jessica arrived at the cafe hours early. Seems like she was scouting the area to find the best seat in the cafe to where it's out of the CCTV view. What Jane says here is right. CCTV cameras actually record Jessica walking into the cafe at 3:30 p.m. when she told the girls to meet at 5. That's 90 minutes earlier than the scheduled meeting time. Again, what is the purpose of you arriving so early? Because if I'm early and I'm in a mall, I would be shopping. I wouldn't be sitting around looking for the cafe. I would just maybe get there 15 minutes early or 30 minutes early. Then the cameras pick up more unusual behavior from Jessica. Just 2 minutes after her arrival, she leaves the cafe, explaining that she's heading out to get gifts for her friends. At 4:14 p.m., she re-enters the premises, carrying 3 shopping bags from Bath and Body Works. However, instead of proceeding to her seat, she navigates through the cafe, surveying her surroundings from various angles. Police speculate that Jessica did this as a precautionary measure for what she was about to do. Because the last thing you want before you poison someone is to get caught by CCTV cameras doing so. She was definitely looking for the most secluded spot in the cafe 1000%. It was too obvious. She glanced around the CCTV a few times. I mean, when I go into a cafe, I don't look for CCTV. I look for a seat. Or maybe the waiter is like, "Hey, do you like this table?" Okay. I'm like, "Yes, this table is okay." Jessica eventually opts to settle in a booth at the corner of the cafe. The foliage did well to obscure her presence from nearby CCTV cameras, but there was one camera situated across the cafe that maintained a direct view of her. It could be possible that Jessica was aware of this. She might have even made eye contact with the camera. However, her subsequent actions are what really stirs intrigue. She proceeds to lift the 3 shopping bags and positions them on the table, effectively obstructing the CCTV from capturing whatever was on the table. Minutes later, Jessica orders drinks for her friends, which arrive at 4:24 p.m. The waiter places the drinks on the table, and upon observing the CCTV footage, it becomes apparent that Jessica slowly repositions the bags, almost as if she's ensuring that the drinks are well concealed. I guess for whatever reason, she really wanted to order for them. So that's what happened. I mean, I would rather order my drinks when I get there, because if it was a hot drink, it'll get cold. If it's a cold drink, the ice would melt. At 5:16 p.m., M&A and honey arrive. The Vietnamese iced coffee that was meant for M&A has been sitting on the table for close to an hour. After sitting down, M&A takes a sip and her expression registers clear distaste with the coffee. Seconds later, her head tilts back and foam is coming out from her mouth. On the 27th of October, 2016, Jessica Kamala Wango was officially convicted for the murder of M.N.A. Salihin. The judges agreed and found the prosecution's case to be convincing and plausible. In their deliberations, the judges found Jessica's conduct on the day of the incident to be incredibly suspicious. Not only did she enter the cafe hours before, seemingly to familiarize herself with the surroundings, she also deliberately placed the shopping bags on the table to obscure the camera's view. Hence, Indonesia's trial of the century reached its conclusion as the judges delivered a verdict of guilty for premeditated murder, resulting in a 20-year prison sentence for Jessica. She would not be facing the firing squad as Jessica was an Australian citizen, and a bilateral agreement between the two nations ensured that the death penalty would not be pursued in the event of her conviction. So, how does Jane feel about the outcome of the trial? It's a little half for us.
We felt that there was justice because they were able to keep Jessica behind bars for 20 years. But I think all of us were hoping for life sentence. There's a little bit of relief because it has been long. I cannot imagine how MNA's family and her husband felt throughout the whole trial. When the news broke out about Jessica's 20-year prison sentence, her legal team declared its intention to lodge an appeal. Expressing his reservations and dissatisfaction, Otto Hazebwin, the chief defense attorney for Jessica, remarked, "We are concerned and disappointed because the judges did not fully consider the evidence that we presented at the trial. The judge has only considered evidence from prosecutors. As of today, Jessica remains behind bars with her sentence intact. The future is uncertain, but what is clear is that her legal team will continue attempting to clear her name. I cannot imagine how MNA's family and her husband felt throughout the whole trial. It's not fun, and I'm sure they want to see the end of the trial and to have the 20 years verdict. I think Sandy is okay with it. I follow Sandy's Instagram. There was a post. She wrote, 'My sister can rest in peace now. The cloud over her head is gone and we can start healing at this point. Thank God. Rest in peace, my dear twin. I love you forever.' MNA is, although she can be tough, she has like a tough exterior. She's actually so loving, so caring inside. I'm going to tear up. She is. She's just super sweet. I don't know how else to explain to her. It's like everyone just used the same words to explain her, but that really is MNA. And it's just so sad that she had that type of she's just taken away so soon. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Nightcared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.